Good morning. Thanks for coming back. We are here to talk about past as prologue in China and building on yesterday's conversations about Ukraine and religion and democracy, including the contentious ones. This morning we turn to a big think conversation on a continent that has 1.4 billion people, including 12.8 million Uyghur Muslims, mostly in Xinjiang, a $17.7 trillion economy compared to 23 trillion in the US and 16.4 trillion in the entirety of Europe, and $193 billion in core military spending compared to, by that same metric, $738 billion for the US military spending. A big think conversation about China. And we have two outstanding experts in Peter Frankopan and Teresa Fallon to lead the way. Conversational questions are broad and open-ended. There are a few of us in the room who do cover China regularly, but most don't. So what's China want? How's its history likely to inform the future? How's its own sense of identity, both the party and the people, compare with the somewhat challenged sense of democratic identity we were talking about yesterday afternoon? China grew far more fascinating to me by reading Peter's outstanding book, The New Silk Roads, which was published in 2015. It's been translated into 42 different languages. It's sold at least 1.5 million copies. I could see that online, maybe more. He then published The New Silk Roads in 2018, which focuses on China's present and future. And I'm about halfway through that one on Audible, and I can't wait to finish it on the way home. So maybe Peter will start us off today and tell us some more. But as he says in the book, China's economic growth has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, just over half its population. Today it's creating 2 new billionaires every month. But also, as he and Teresa both remind us, the CCCP doesn't clearly knows what it wants, maybe except for that exit with Hu Jintao from the stage to the left the other day, last month. The party knows what it wants, knows what it thinks of Uyghur Muslims, and it boasts the second largest military in the world. So we've asked Peter and Teresa to talk about a few big questions. What will come of pro-democracy efforts in Hong Kong? What's the long-term ambition in Taiwan? And of course, how's the world's response to Putin and Ukraine affect Xi's calculation on Taiwan? How does China's Belt and Road Initiative implicate both Europe and the United States? What's really happening with the Uighurs? What about journalists who are working in China, whether Western or Chinese, as well as political dissidents? What's the direction now of China's crackdowns, including Stanley Prison, those who are jailed there? And what norms and expectations around Chinese surveillance, including what's public versus restrained? How does that affect what we know and what we don't know and what we write and what we think about China? Okay, you've got their bios. Peter's going to start us off. He is a professor of global history, just to supplement a little bit, at Worcester College at Oxford. He's the author of 4 books, including a 2012 book on the First Crusade. The updated, forward-looking version of Peter's book, The New Silk Roads, just won the Human Sciences Prize from the Caracal Foundation, and he also runs, while he's not parenting 4 children, he runs the Oxford Center for Byzantine Research. For her part, Teresa Fallon is the founder and the director of CREASE, which is the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Brussels. And she's also a super connector. She's a member of the Council on Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific, non-resident social senior fellow at the Chicago Council for Global Affairs. She's an adjunct professor at the Marshall European Center for Security Studies. She's a member of the AI task force, cybersecurity task force for the CEPS. She's a member of the LOSIC group on transatlantic relations, and she's a member of the National Committee on USChina Relations. She's testified before the US Congress, before the House of Lords. She's an expert in the Belt and Road Initiative, great power competition, global governance, and her presentation today will focus mostly on EU-Asia relations, EU-Europe relations. Teresa and Peter, welcome to Faith Angle, and the China floor is yours, Peter.
Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the team for arranging such a fantastic venue. And I'm in the presence of greatness. I read so many of your bylines, so I'm thrilled and slightly intimidated to be here with you. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try and paint, the title of our session is Past is Prologue. I'm going to try and paint a little bit of the history of where we are, but try to answer where how China has become the kind of place that it is and where it might be going. I know we've got a long session, so I'm going to leave plenty of space of some of those questions that Josh had for you to shape around the Q&A. So I'm interested in exchange of all kind, and as a historian who covers wide periods, regions, etc., I guess even as a small boy, I figured out that almost all the things that were most interesting that happened in the world didn't happen in Europe. Europe's rise is very recent, and that has shaped how we look at the world. We sort of expect everybody to turn up like we have, and we're not particularly good at understanding how we got to where we are in our own histories in the West. So, for example, in the year 1400, Europe controlled about 5% of the world's surface. By 1900, it covered about 80%, or controlled about 80% of the world's surface. So things like European values that can be thrown around quite easily mean something very different in parts of the world that its encounter with Europe was not about institution building, freedoms, in fact, quite the opposite. It was how did other parts of the world fuel the growth of the continent we're in here. But when I was young, it would seem to me quite interesting that the first great leader that I read about, Alexander the Great, wasn't interested in Cap Ferrat and South France, which I always thought when I was growing up was the best and nicest, most expensive place to go on holiday. And always even interested in Italy, which everyone knew even at that age. Rome built a big empire, but everything for the ancient Greeks was really about orientation eastwards, and that's the same for classical Greece in antiquity, from Herodotus the whole way onwards. There's almost no attention at all paid to Sicily, North Africa, the Adriatic. Apart from small settler colonies, the whole orientation was eastwards towards Persia in particular, but then towards Indian, or now Indian Chinese civilizations too. And I think that poses a different way of looking at history and looking at the world, which is how do civilizations rise? What are the things that make them tick? How did those changes happen that these parts of the world that we spend in the European curriculum at school and university, we spend no time working on? It's the same in the United States. There's a little bit around the Dark Ages, what used to be called the Dark Ages, but those periods between the classical world, which is why I reacted a little bit yesterday to the sort of use of Athens, because we then pick history up again around about 1500. So no one looks at Islam, no one looks at Indus Valley civilizations. Very few people know about the Chola, about the Srijavaya, about the Tang dynasties, about the Maya. That whole sort of story has edited a version of history that's quite important to recenter. And that's hugely important in parts of the world, particularly east of Istanbul. I mean, it's not just about Asia, about reconfiguring what the past looks like as well as what does the present and the future. And that's an extremely sharp conversation right now in India, and it's an extremely sharp conversation in China. So my books have been about looking at the history of these places and trying to see what their pasts have been, different peoples, connectivities, where do nomads and unsettled peoples fit in, how do oral traditions work, what does racism look like in the context of Asia, where it's a very different experience about colonization to how things look like perhaps in more familiar parts of the world. And I guess that all prompts the question of change. History is always about change. In our 21st century, and we could argue the toss about which sequence one might want to put these, we didn't talk much about technology yesterday, but obviously technology is fundamentally changing the world we live in. Inequality is the primary issue of social and political concern almost every country on earth. It doesn't get discussed perhaps as much as it should do. Competence of the state, we heard about political models, how those evolve and are they under threat. Existential crisis, we heard about yesterday. Clearly climate change is already throwing up some significant problems, but I suspect in the decades ahead those will become extremely difficult to deal with, and we spend almost no time thinking about those at all. The discussions around what climate change will do, everyone throws out the word migration and war without any sort of shaping as to where those might happen, what should our roles be as individual nations, which countries are most likely to find problems. What we intend to do is to say, well, look, Pakistan had 8 times the normal level of rain, 33 million people displaced. Maybe we can give a few tax dollars or personal dollars to help relief efforts rather than more systemic questions about what's going to come towards us. And then we talked a bit about it last night. I'm particularly interested and concerned about new disease environments that come towards us. All of those kind of quite scary worlds for ourselves, not just our next generations to be thinking about, are important. But China is involved in all of those. China underpins the questions of technologies, inequalities, political models, disease environments, It's no coincidence that that the first major pandemic of the 21st century emerged from China, but so too did the so-called Hong Kong flu and the Asian viruses in the 1950s and 60s. And when you have large populations who are highly urbanized, as we all learnt in lockdown, the ability for disease to spread is much, much greater than when you're scattered across wide regions. So in 1900, about 3% of the world's population lived in cities. By 2050, over 70% will. And those are great if you're a pathogen or you're looking to spread yourself to a new host. So China's involved in all of those. I guess from a sort of geopolitical point of view, China sort of appeared almost from nowhere. With the Obama Asia-Pacific pivot, that was 2014, 2015, there was a sudden awareness or reorientation of US foreign policy, military policy, socioeconomic policy, that China was a bigger and more substantial problem. And I think that was how the Obama administration looked at China, that needed to be understood as well as managed. But that Asia-Pacific pivot, and I'm sure Teresa will say something about that, is something that we jumped onto late here with the EU as well. Putin had his own pivot to what the Asia-Pacific means from most of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region. China looms large in all of those, as it does in the Indian Ocean world too, partly because of the way that China, we'll talk about that I'm sure with questions, China's role in the Indian Ocean and along the high seas. But that sudden rise of China's GDP, it's gone up about 15 to 16 times in the last 20 years, which is extremely rapid. And the idea that China's become a political threat. And I guess the first takeaway question from that is, how come was China a threat all along? What changed that made us wake up in 2014, 2015 to think this was a significant issue? And to give some sort of just a sort of particularly cheap shot, but in 2015, Xi came on a state visit to the United Kingdom and had a pint of beer with David Cameron at his favourite Oxford pub. And we announced in the UK that this was the start of a golden age of cooperation with China, something repeated by Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. And we've more or less in the UK gone over the course of between 2015 and probably 2018 for China being the answer to all of our problems to being the source of all of our problems. And that requires some very careful thought, not just from understanding how we make decisions. That requires a little bit of brain power to go into how is that understood in Beijing. Because despite the fact that I think it's quite well known, we've changed our leaders quite regularly in the United Kingdom recently. 44 days of a Prime Minister and 38 days. I think we've had 4 Chancellors this year. The same personnel have been in charge in Beijing for at least a decade. So Xi's been in power for about 11 years. All of the team around him, there's been a little reshuffle in the Politburo of the 20th Party Congress, but essentially it's exactly the same people saying exactly the same things in exactly the same way. And in fact, we could probably map that out to Moscow too, where it's an even longer pedigree of more than 20 years of the same top team in power. And so the big question, like in any relationship, is did they change or did we? And if we changed, why did we change? If they changed, how and why did they change too? So to pick out a couple of quotes from the US National Defense Strategy, the US badged in 2018 China as having the aim, as a quote, of the displacement of the United States, I beg your pardon, to achieve global preeminence. And that's a pretty punchy assessment to publish in a national defense strategy that's publicly accessible. John Sullivan, acting head of state in the same year, identified China, Russia, and Iran as forces of global instability. And that, I think, that process about what we're trying to look at China tends to be through the lens of how is it a threat? What does it do wrong? Where does it compromise the rights of its citizens, Uighurs, you mentioned, Josh, and in terms of surveillance states? But how do we understand it? Or, and this gets said a lot by US officials in particular, Mike Pompeo in 2019, repeated in the US defense strategy produced by President Biden last month, is that, this is a quote from Pompeo, that the United States and its allies needs to ensure that China retains only its proper place in the world. And that choice of language, I think, is quite interesting in a post-colonial world about what a proper place is and how that process is going to be managed. And again, we don't just need to think about what that means to us, it's how does that sound and how's that interpreted in Beijing and in China. And when I talk about China, and you're very experienced, I'm using China interchangeably with the Communist Party of China rather than the Chinese people. We have a broadly similar view in the United Kingdom. I was involved in something called the Integrated Review that was published last year, where the assessment of the UK Foreign Office, Treasury and Ministry of Defence is that the primary challenges facing the United Kingdom outside non-state actors and terrorism and cybercrime and so on were whole-of-state actors, in particular China and Russia, and to some extent Iran. Integrated Review identified China as a systemic competitor, and that China will be the most significant geopolitical factor of the 2020s, partly because, and these again quotes, the scale and the reach of its economy, the size of its population, its technological advancement, the increasing ambition of China to project its power, for example, through the Belt and Road that I will not talk about hugely here, but we will talk, I'm sure, in the Q&A, and that these will have profound implications worldwide. Clearly, China's authoritarian model, its different values, whatever in fact values really mean if one drills into those, are hugely significant, but the challenge is how to harness the good bits that we want to take, growth, trade, climate cooperation, and how do we manage the bits that we don't want to deal with or find difficult, and how do we build, as the Integrated Review called it, very euphemistically, a robust diplomatic framework, which means something and it means nothing. So I guess it's obvious why China is a challenge and a source of concern. And again, there's no particular order to these, but clearly Taiwan is an important talking point, a thought point. Another one is about the attitudes towards intellectual property. Another towards the assertiveness that the Integrated Review mentions, and in particular wolf warrior policies. Sort of Chinese diplomats, particularly foreign affairs spokesmen, tend not to take things lying down. They're hyper-aggressive in their choice of language. The cyber capabilities that China has through state actors or state-sanctioned, where the FBI open a major case every 10 hours against China-sourced cyber attacks. The passive causes, where China is kind of part of our problem, whether we like it or not. And I'm thinking here particularly about jobs being offshored out of developed economies into not just China, but into South and East Asia too, which has been fantastic for the global poor. Josh mentioned 800 million out of poverty, and it's a very fluid line, exactly what poverty actually means, and that's a World Bank metric rather than mine. But those beneficiaries of hyperglobalization in the last 30 years have been the global poor. And that's come at the expense of some of the people we spoke about yesterday, the disenfranchised, or as Hillary Clinton called them, the deplorables, Democrat voters who've got nowhere to go, and the sort of pushback towards China across every single democratic, and in fact also authoritarian systems too. So the single quickest way to lose an election today in the high-income countries is to call for higher and closer cooperation with China, which strikes me as quite a curious culmination of Chinese economic and foreign policy to turn the whole world against you because of aggressive economic policy. So how to manage China's rise, or as Bob Zoellick put it in 2005, how is China going to become a responsible stakeholder? The way we see it in the West is that China needs to prove itself in how it should engage with all of us, and it needs to behave in a way that we approve of, appreciate, and benefit from. And so all these questions, I think, come down to what does that actually mean? What does a rising, growing, prosperous China mean? How much of a concern is it that China's, and it's not China's fleet, it's the People's Liberation Army, which belongs and is controlled by the Communist Party. The military is not a Chinese national military, it's a Communist Party military. What does it matter if China could put more naval vessels out to sea than the United States? Does it matter what size they are? Does it matter what range they have? Does it matter what kind of defensive or offensive capabilities it has? What's the position on hypersonics or of advanced technologies where we in the West are developing quite quickly some of these capabilities? Is the fact that China is doing that acceptable or unacceptable? And if it's unacceptable, why is it okay that we do so? But also, how is China and its growing reach going to change our world around us? So before the pandemic, the number of Chinese visitors globally outbound and the spend they had was already changing our high streets, what our hotels look like, what was on the menus, how things are decorated, property prices from New Zealand through to San Francisco, all compressed by very large volumes of Chinese capital coming in to acquire. Here in France, a huge challenge around vineyards in Bordeaux in particular being bought up by Chinese buyers. And the question, which I'm not going to again talk here, but we'll do with in Q&A, is this a form of colonization, right? Neo-colonization, China's threats, for example, with the acquisition of a 26% share of the port of Hamburg. This is neo-colonialism, colonization. And as a modest, pedantic historian, I can tell you that's not what colonization looks like. Colonization is not people coming to invest in your infrastructure and buying things from you that you choose to sell and you can't find another buyer for, or you sell for a higher price to China. Colonization is when people are carted off in chains to other parts of the world, or your resources taken out of the ground to build cathedrals and art galleries elsewhere. So I think we need to use these words quite carefully, because the one thing that we get wrong with China is we have no visibility, knowledge, information, a way of analysing what China really is. There's a very good article by James Palmer called "No One Knows Anything About China," including the Communist Party of China, which is a slightly second half of the sentence. No one knows anything about China. We have almost complete ignorance. I know some of you have had experience being based out in China. It's very difficult to run journalistic operations out there, freedom of speech, surveillance. But even in terms of eyes and ears on the ground, China per capita has half the number of foreigners living in it as North Korea does. North Korea has per capita twice as many foreigners living in Pyongyang than China does across the whole of China. And it means that our capacity to misunderstand, misevaluate, and to see the pictures that we want to see is extremely high. So in the United Kingdom today, as I sit here, we've got about 300 undergraduates in total studying Chinese. In France in the 1980s, there were 2 PhDs in Chinese history, 8 in total in the 1990s, only 2 of which got permanent jobs. Right? That's a black hole of such profound dereliction of duty if you're worried about what China might mean in the future and how one might try to understand it. So I'm not going to ask any of you, but I do ask my students, can you name a single Chinese actor or Chinese film star? Have you ever seen a Chinese film that you can remember or think of? And we are absolutely in the blind. So when you say, for example, when you evaluate that in things like the number 1 ranked airline in China for Chinese consumers for the decade before the pandemic started was Aeroflot, which maybe you've had the pleasure of flying on Aeroflot. It's not as bad as it was in the 1980s, I can promise you that. But this is not just because the Russians or the Chinese like the Russians. It's about a whole different set of configurations about how other people see the world and how other people see us as well. And some of these things are completely seismic in their scale. So under some projections, here to talk about faith, about 5 to 6 years ago, lots of scholars and lots of work was going around Christian communities in China and their size, around about 45 million Christians in China, and the estimates that were by 2030 that China might have more regular churchgoers than the United States. Right? So these kinds of things, which are hugely important and significant in terms of what does that mean? What does faith mean in China? Can you be a Christian and a Marxist-Leninist? And I can point you to South America to show you that it's perfectly capable to do those both. But I think these kinds of ideas around what are we actually looking at, we need to be extremely careful in how we frame our analysis and very modest in trying to assess our goals and try to work out what it is that we look at. The eyes and ears are highly controlled, and our capacity to gather information is very low. Intelligence networks were dismantled, compromised, etc. Ability to find out what's being said in the Politburo or at highest levels, or almost zero, and involves enormous amounts of very careful judgment, which is the worst possible kind of thing you want. You want as much information as possible rather than rely on being able to see things and do it with nuance. So those kinds of things around how do we get it wrong, it's quite, I suppose, quite obvious that we're going to get China wrong if we don't invest in looking at where it's come from, where it's going. And if I was in a more punchy mood or had more coffee, I'd say the same thing about Iran, I'd say the same thing about India, I'd say the same thing about Pakistan, I'd say the same thing about almost every single country in Asia, and including sub-Saharan Africa and, quite frankly, North Africa, our petri dish of the self-aberration of what Europe means is a real prison that stops us, I think, from engaging with other parts of the world. To the point that, and I was in Washington recently with some high-ranking State Department officials, And I said, I understand. I don't need any explanation about what the benefits are of democracies, of all the things we get wrong. We flog ourselves in the Western world, but there are lots of things we get right. Carl said yesterday, democracies do lots of things really well. There are lots of things we could do better. We don't bring everyone along for the ride. They're disenfranchised populations, but there are some obvious wins. But I spoke in the State Department, and I asked, what are the three most important or the best foreign policy outcomes the United States has achieved since 1990? Where are the wins? And maybe if you can answer me that one in our Q&A, that would be great. I mean, if I was the US State, who are the cleverest people I've ever met, they are spectacularly brilliant. They speak languages, they really invest their time, they take soundings from outside. But the point, I guess, with that question is not to be a smart-ass and say, tell me what you did right in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, etc., which you can answer in the positive too. But if the bottom line is over these last 30 years, and the Cold War we can look at too if you want, has our ability to identify threats been consistently right, or has it been consistently wrong? If we had China wrong in 2015 and it was a threat, are we wrong in what China is today? How are we in a position where we could think, like our German cousins did, that German gas would always flow no matter what? How do you wake up one morning and say, we got that wrong? Because the next question is then, what else are you getting wrong? What comes next? Where are the other things you're looking at too? And I guess I'll just run through a little bit of the history. Am I okay time-wise?
Great.
And we've got like a long time. They thought it was such a hostile question. I had to climb back down, and I spent like a psychiatrist the next 10 minutes saying, I'm not here for you to tell you what I think. It's just, how would you, if you were sitting with your counterparts, what is it that you'd say we've done really well? Because global prosperity is important, and the US engine has been important in that. You could say that the US taxpayer and consumers help drive healthcare benefits in the developing world, maternal healthcare, child mortalities, all the things that have been great, clean water. Technologies have allowed us all to communicate better, but those are all private sector things, and those are sort of knock-on effects rather than where we got things really right.
So they did an answer.
I'm going to go back. Let have a chance to think about it. But just to sort of as a historian, I guess that's why I'm here. How we've engaged the West, and I'm broadly speaking about Europe and the United States and Western allies like Canada, Australia, and so on. Just to run through some of the ways in which we've got China possibly wrong, and maybe would explain why we're at this, what some people like Henry Kissinger call a new Cold War. So at the end of the First World War in the Versailles settlements, even though 300,000 Chinese had been involved fighting on the fighting on the Western Front here in Europe, the Chinese were excluded from any post-war settlements. We treated the Chinese as though they'd arrived at the party selectively late and didn't have any right to decide what their fate should be around European assets in places like Shandong and the Peninsula. In the end of the 1940s, the United States, for incredible reason, it's quite something when you invest your money to rebuild an enemy you just conquered. But the Marshall Plan built Europe back up into what it became. And that was all based on the United States taking a view around what its view would be about Europe. But there was no Marshall Plan for China, which had been ravaged since 1933, a very heavy war with Japan, and then Civil War II. So China was left on the outside of that too. The warming up after Mao, the warming up of relations with the United States was purely because China acted as a convenient counterbalance to the Soviet Union in the early 1970s. And at that point, it was about finding alliances against Moscow. China was brought on side by the Nixon administration with Kissinger to try to find a way of stabilizing and building a world that suited how Washington perceived its threats to be at the time. And to give just some I think, important context, I've been reading recently Frank Dakota's book that covers the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. The day after the Tiananmen Square massacre, President Bush addressed the US people and said that the Tiananmen massacre was an unfortunate incident, that Deng was a forward-looking leader, and that the United States shouldn't judge the whole of the PLA by what happened in Beijing.
Sorry, I'm late to do this. Can you take your name tag off?
Yeah, am I roughing?
Affecting the sound.
Okay.
On the other hand, it means the Chinese can't even listen. So
I'm pretty sure they can.
Go.
Less than a week after Tiananmen Square, Henry Kissinger sent through back channels to Beijing to tell the Politburo that he was an old and true friend of the Communist Party of China. So even in the wake of Tiananmen Square, with tanks on the streets, 100,000 people minimum in Tiananmen Square itself, the way in which China and our American attempts, in this particular case, Brent Skokov too, following through with similar kinds of reports, about what it was that China represented, what kind of opportunities, was profound misjudgment. And extremely, I think, to use George Bush's words, extremely unfortunate in retrospect, that the opportunity to talk about what happened were completely lost. That process over the last 30 years, you can run through German policy under Helmut Kohl, Schroeder lifting arms bans, Merkel pinning a great significant part of the German economy on access to Chinese markets without the reciprocal benefits that they might have asked for, Clinton bringing China into the WTO, and then being convinced that this would be, as Clinton put it at the time, that he was convinced that we would see democracy in his lifetime in China. And one of the WTO negotiators, as they put it, they said, this is a win-win for the United States. They give, we take. What's not to like? And I think that idea about what it was that China would do and what it would turn into, there are some salutary lessons in that kind of failure to analyse what was going on, because not a single moment since, in fact, opening up of China in 92, and not a single moment since then has the Chinese Communist Party ever considered any form of meaningful opening up, any form of meaningful press freedoms, any meaningful attempts to have a symmetric relationship economically or politically with any Western state, or in fact with any of its neighbours, and nor any attempt to try to not game our system, which is China's big competitive advantage. It can subsidise all of its exports and then undercut manufacturers that then take big companies out of the picture. That model has been hugely successful for China, no question about it, whichever way you look at it. Poverty, 80,000 kilometres of high-speed rail links that allow, obviously, people to move around quicker, cheaper. That galvanises trade. And the wealth creation in China has been huge. And like we've done with the United States, I beg your pardon, with Russia, Western countries have been extremely eager to find comfortable homes for the billions that have been pushed out of the system or hidden out of the system. So in the state of Delaware alone, there are 300 billionaires of Chinese origin. Delaware is a great state if you want to... South Dakota. South Dakota is a great place to park cash if you don't want anybody to track where you put your money. And as we learned with Russia, or should have learned with Russia, when you allow cash to leach out of the system, you prevent the emergence of the middle class, you allow for massive elite structures that are difficult in the long run, you build up highly complicated political structures, and you bring business that has significant implications for your own populations too. So those processes, I think, of how China has reached where it is are really important to understand. Now, I'm looking at my watch, Josh, and I've got a kind of, I've got still quite a bit more to go. So do you want me to pause for breath and then maybe pick some of this back up, or do you want me to...
You're doing great. You've got about 5 to 7 more minutes.
Sure? Okay. Gosh, I've got all this stuff. All this stuff is, I think, is so interesting. The history stuff. I'm gonna leave the. Oh God, that's awful. Okay, I'm gonna leave. Please, someone ask me about history when we do questions. Okay, so I'll sort of pick up all that history stuff. Okay, so let's do this from a perspective of Beijing, right? So if one takes a long view of, let's say, the last century, around about 1900, it was very similar discussions took place in India at the time, which was the primary question for political philosophers was, how is it possible that the subcontinent of India and China, which had been the leading global economies and political systems for 1,000, maybe 2,000 years, maybe even 3,000 years, how had they been overtaken by crummy little island in the North Atlantic? And Britain's ability to build an empire is a source of extraordinary achievement and asks lots of kinds of questions, one of which is around what representative democracy was in the first place. We had a little bit about that. I definitely would like to come back and talk about what that meant. But the question was how is it possible that Europe had colonized everywhere, and these great civilizations, China and India in particular, had not only failed to do so, but had been colonized in the process. And the Opium Wars, the ways in which the two envoys were humiliated in the 1850s that eventually ended in a British raid that burnt the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, stole all of the treasures, which now some of them sit in the Ashmolean in Oxford. How is it possible that China had lost its place in the world and had been relegated to the role of a vassal? And the answers to those questions, how to fix that, were people like Sun Yat-sen and then Mao. It was about changing China from an agrarian, rural, so-called backward population into an industrial powerhouse. And implicit in all of that, running through the last 100 years, was China never wanted to be humiliated again. So in China today, it's called the Century of Humiliation, sort of roughly from 1800 to 1900 in the Boxer Rebellion. And in fact, there's now, since the beginning of the century, the last 20 years, there's a National Day of Humiliation, which is funny. We celebrate Trafalgar Day in England. We celebrate, most places celebrate good things, Declaration of Independence. China has a National Humiliation Day to enforce into its people and its population that the West have framed us. The reason why we are catching up and have to look after ourselves is because of the way in which we've been misunderstood, poorly treated by colonial imperialist powers. And that language translates very nicely into Marxist-Leninist thinking about resource extrapolation and extraction and so on. So over the last 100 years, one of the stories that goes right the way through China, its engagement in its perception of itself, is that the United States in particular, but the West, are trying to change China. They're trying to corrupt them. They're trying to trap China by peaceful means into changing its systems. And from Deng Xiaoping to Li Peng to Hu Jintao to Jiang Zemin to Xi, who repeats it all the time, China, as well as not opening up its markets properly, will never be a multi-party state. It says this again and again and again. Interestingly, in the last 18 months, China has started to play on the fact that it is trying to present itself as the world's biggest democracy. It's a change of pace in terms of parking tanks on our lawns. China, its constitution, is a democracy under the dictatorship of the Communist Party. And talking to Chinese intellectuals, political scientists, and government machine now, what the Communist Party is very keen to try and do is to say, what is democracy? And if democracy is about competence and it's about outcomes, surely the best democracy is the one that delivers the biggest and greatest outcomes for the largest number of people. And what the Chinese are now saying is, well, if you can produce people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos who have their own space programs, that looks like it's imperialist capitalist elite feudal structures. Look at China, where 800 million will be taken out of poverty and 70,000 kilometers of railroads, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we are late to that idea about how do we handle the disingenuity of that argument, handle the questions about where that's right. At what point are we failing the bottom sections of our society, minorities and so on and so forth? So I did an event just before lockdown with Mike Mullen, who'd been chair of the Joint Chiefs, and a very, very smart Chinese entrepreneur / up-and-coming man to watch. And the first time anybody mentioned the Uighurs, he was straight on to US prison numbers, the number of the black population in the United States, transmission of infectious diseases, illiteracy levels, reoffending rates, and then to say, well, look, this compares with what we do with the Uighurs, which is we educate and we provide jobs and employment and we get them to sing songs celebrating the Communist Party of China. But I think that we need to be listening quite carefully to the Chinese interpretation of what it is they think we're trying to do, trying to change them, trying to pollute with the, bit like we hear from Putin, the decadence of the West, that the Chinese will never be petit bourgeois. And if you spent any time in China, China's fantastic at being petit bourgeois. They're the most petit bourgeois of all in lots of ways in how they want to do things, which is great because China's a fantastically vibrant and diverse society. But that idea of what the West represents as a threat also has real political convenience in China. So after Tiananmen Square, the notorious was called the Central Document Number 7, produced in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square. And again, I'll just quote it before I wrap up. Says that the, quote, entire imperialist world tries to make us abandon the socialist role and to turn us into a vassal of international monopoly capitalism. And that hasn't changed in the last 30 years. That's how she talks. That's how she thinks. Partly because Marxism-Leninism is a form of religion in its own right. It's a system of beliefs. It requires biblical texts that one refers to. It has the veneration of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and the sainthood. But the primary role that this has is partly to allow the Communist Party to have a mantra that explains its own control over the state. And we in the West insert ourselves into Chinese thinking much, much greater ways than actually is real. China, the Chinese Politburo, Chinese domestic politics are not uninterested in what we're doing and are not unthreatened, but the main driver in Chinese politics, Chinese markets, and the kinds of questions that they have. It's not about China and its relationship with the world. It's not about a new Cold War. It's about how does China reform itself? How does it control power? And in that sense, as a kind of sign-off, what I think is interesting about Xi, of whom there's not an English language biography, by the way, which, a bit like I said to my students when they applied to Oxford a few years ago, one of the we like to ask questions they haven't been prepped on. It's a very hostile, very difficult thing to get into these universities. So we try to make it not, we don't ask how many wives does Henry VIII have, or, is the United States a great power and why? But I said I did one year, I asked the students, have you read Donald Trump's autobiography, Art of the Deal? And if not, why not? Because none of them would have done. Why would you, if you're an 18-year-old, have read it? But, it's a kind of perfectly fair question to ask. And by and large, all the kids who are from privileged, rich backgrounds all say, I'd never been told to read it. And kids from less privileged backgrounds would kick off and ask why it was a valid question, which is exactly what you want. But the fact is, if Xi is as important a systemic existential threat, the fact that it's so hard to find information about him, that there's no market for reading books about him, I know that there are in other languages a few biographies, finding information about him tells us, I think, a lot about how we grasp in the dark to try to find challenges. But the most interesting thing, I think, about Xi is that when he came to power in 2012, this was a golden age, I think, in China. The middle classes were rising. There were Gucci stores opening up in second, third, and fourth tier cities. There was huge ambition about what China meant in the world, huge optimism. They'd just come off the back of the Beijing Olympics. Social media was booming, outbound Chinese travel, really engagement with the rest of the world. China had a very high stock generally with its neighbors, which it still does, by the way. I mean, the negativity about China is a Western thing. In Africa in particular, almost every single of the 54 countries, China's reputation and stock is high and remains high. But at that time, where there were opportunities, Xi only saw risks and threat. And I suppose one question which would be good for the Q&A is, was he right? Was he right to see threats? Is China and the model compromised, under stress, facing difficulties? Is there a challenge coming towards China that requires the kinds of things that Xi has done, crackdowns on fan clubs, high net worth, moving money out of the country? Why is it that Xi and the Communist Party have closed ranks in the way they have? Is it because of what we're doing, which is how almost everybody thinks, or is it about what's going on in the dynamics inside China itself? So my final sort of sign-off, I guess, would be we should think quite carefully about what China really is rather than what we want to see. We should think a little bit about what it is that interests Chinese intellectuals and scholars. A lot of attention paid to the fall of the Soviet Union, and that I think is quite revealing in its own self. But also, the stuff I know that you work on, many of you, and write about and think about, around what does China's role within this Ukraine crisis and within the kind of global new orders look like, whether it's in terms of BRICS, whether it's in terms of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whether it's China, as Bob Zelic said, responsible stakeholder, what that means, China's role within the United Nations, but also rather than trying to work out what we think about China, also trying to think about how China, Communist Party, Beijing, intellectuals think about us. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Teresa.
Well, good morning, everyone. Peter Frankopan is like the hardest person to follow. He is so amazing, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with him. I'm a big fan of his. I read all his books, and he's got a new tome coming out in March, everyone, so please make sure you watch for that as it's being published. Well, it's a joy to be here. Thank you so much, Josh, for the invitation. I want to give a shout out to Nicole and Alyssa as well for everything going so smoothly. This is the most beautiful part of the world. I'm just delighted and honored to be with all of you. And as Peter, I'm also very intimidated by the brains around this table and your beautiful ideas and hyper ability to communicate. So, why am I interested in this topic? like Peter, when he was growing up and he looked at that map on the wall in his room, I was fascinated by seeing these stories about the Silk Road. And I, as a child, reading the Chicago Tribune, they had these trips to look at the Silk Road, and that really grabbed my attention. So when I actually ended up in the region and traveled around, I would always get so excited about seeing a caravanserai or anything that was somehow connected to all of this. And so I had the opportunity to live and work in Moscow, and then I did that for about 5.5 years, and then I moved to Beijing. And most people don't do that, like immediately from Moscow to Beijing. So my first 3 months in Beijing, all I could see was Soviet and Russian influence. And in the architecture and the way things are designed, my son at that time was about 2.5 years old, and he was my firstborn, so I wanted him to learn Chinese, and you have to learn it before 3 years old to have no problems with tone. So I was really like a tiger mom there. So I'm like, okay, where are we going to put him into school? And he was really kind of rejecting all the Chinese schools I put him into. And so someone from the Russian embassy said, well, why don't you put him in our embassy? I mean, the Russians are always looking for cultivating people over the years. But I thought, well, maybe we can do this just for a few months so he can have little Russian friends, keep up his Russian language skills, and he can learn Chinese later on. So I would go to the Russian embassy every day. It's the biggest embassy in the world, and it dates back from the time of Peter the Great. And it's this massive park really in the middle of Beijing. And I would, cycle there with my son, and it was like a breath of fresh air because, as you know, Beijing is just chock-a-block with people. It's so crowded. And here with like this beautiful park, very quiet and peaceful, and it was September, the leaves were changing. So I thought, I wonder if they'll let me do this. And I just thought every day they would stop me. So I would jog around the park and think, next time they're going to tell me, you can't do that, you have to leave. And I mustn't be a very fast runner. So they weren't very suspicious of me. They could track me pretty well. But I know about every inch of that embassy just about. And so I would go to events later. This happened for about 3 months. And then my husband's like, you're telling me how beautiful it is there. I want to come. And so after that, I was never allowed in. It became more and more difficult to even take my son into school there. But one other comment about the school experience there, even though the school on this Russian embassy grounds, I mean, it smelled like Russia. They even used the same floor polish. I mean, it was they never changed the nameplate. It was still Soviet school number 654. And the teacher who really intimidated me would say to me at that time, so this was, I was there from 1998 to 2003. So it was a time when they were kind of cultivating people to, as Putin now, we understand through Masha Gessen from the New Yorker, she wrote a great piece about this, how they were trying to cultivate this kind of militant idea in the young. But I didn't know that at that time, and I just thought this teacher is a bit odd because she said, you must bring a gun. Like a play gun, to school. And I wasn't really thrilled about that idea. So I just thought maybe my Russian's and she's like, he is the only boy here who doesn't have a gun. You must bring a gun. And so my son was very enterprising, and he managed somehow to steal a pistolet, a little plastic gun from someone in the playground. So he had a little gun, and all the other Russian boys had Kalashnikovs. But he had some problems about that. So anyway, this was my experience on China-Russia. My initial experiences in China. And so this was a massive embassy ground, and there wasn't a single Chinese person on the entire place. Every tree hedge, every leaf was raked up by a Russian. They didn't trust any Chinese. So this idea that, I always found it so interesting that sometimes I would have a meeting and I would ask, we had some help, a nanny, to maybe pick up my son at the grounds of the embassy, and they would never, ever, no matter what kind of documentation, no matter what was, like an ukaz, a Russian special document that we had sealed in plastic, they would never allow any Chinese. So that brings me to this kind of relationship between Russia and China. Many people have described it as a marriage of convenience, but I would also suggest there's really deep distrust, and it works to their benefit at this point. So I would also describe it as maybe more of a frenemies relationship, because Russia is so weak at this point. Instead of, to go back just a little bit in history, one of the first things you notice in Beijing is this incredible, Russian type of buildings. Like, do you remember the Stalin kind of wedding cake buildings? So you see this, it was a tower of friendship that is built in Beijing. And it was one of the most important times of tech transfer between the Soviet Union and China. So at the time, it was called, Russia was seen as a big brother, and China was the little brother. And so they owe almost a great debt to the Soviets for this period. It didn't last very long. There was a falling out. And now we're, fast forward to February 4th, in the run-up to the Olympics, we had the Xi and Putin meeting, the first meeting that they had after COVID, and many journalists christened it the No Limits Partnership. So if anyone saw yesterday, I think it was the Wall Street Journal kind of broke the story, and also the Financial Times, China is trying to kind of distance itself a little bit, at least rhetorically, from Russia at this point because of the war in Ukraine. So February 4th was when the agreement was signed. 20 days later, the invasion began. Now, according to the press, China says, we had no idea there was going to be a war. Back in 2008, we saw with the Olympics, during the opening ceremony, this was China's coming out party. What happened on the day of the opening ceremony? Russia invaded Georgia. So while everyone was watching the PLA, play the drums, all the diplomats were actually talking about the invasion of Georgia. And so that kind of stole some of the limelight from China's big coming out party at the Olympics. So my analysis is that it was almost a gentleman's agreement. You're not going to do this invasion of Ukraine until after the Olympics, because right after the Olympics concluded, that's when the invasion of Ukraine took place. So this is just a guess. I can't, this is speculation, but I think that there shows that there's some sort of gentleman's agreement between the two of them. And the other issue is that if Xi Jinping had no idea that this was going to happen, how do we explain how he actually started to buy grains and started to put oil in his special reserves? So my analysis is that Putin tipped him off that this was going to happen, but maybe Putin also believed it would only take a few days, like what happened with Crimea. It was largely bloodless, it was done in a few days, and there were really not that many ramifications because it happened in 2014. We saw the Germans sign the Nord Stream 2 energy deal in 2015. So if I was Putin, I would think maybe there aren't so many ramifications for annexing Crimea and having a war going on that's still going on since 2014 in Donbass. So with the prescience of Josh, this morning I woke up, I couldn't sleep because I was so excited about oh my gosh, what happened last night at the G20? And so I had to read everything because I was afraid, you might ask me about that. So President Biden and Xi had a meeting on the side in the run-up to the G20. And so it seems now there's a bit of cooling because we saw a lot of tensions with Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And so everyone's kind of wondering what this all means. Now, there's a lot of women in this room, and when I used to do aerobics, there was this squeeze, squeeze, release, this type of exercise that you do, right, ladies? We know what we're talking about here. Well, I apply that to China because it's kind of squeeze, squeeze, and then I would say right now we're in the release pose. So there's been a lot of tension, and now there's kind of a cooling, a relaxation, but they do this throughout history. So I'm going to just read you the readout from the US side, because there's always two versions of these things, as we all know. You're journalists, you have a lot of experience with that. So this is the meeting with Xi and Putin. The United States does not seek a new Cold War, does not seek to revitalize alliances against China, does not support Taiwan independence, in quotes, does not support, quotes, two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan, and has no intention to have a conflict with China. President Biden said, adding that the US side has no intention to seek, quote, decoupling from China to halt China's economic development or to contain China. So these are all the things that China wants to hear. And I would say that the decoupling narrative isn't something that we should really be worried about. Right now, we're seeing a chip war going on. So the US is going at the very, very highest level. This will kind of cripple China's development of military. And some people have said, look, Russia-China relations are so interesting now. China is exporting chips to Russia because of the sanctions on Russia. And out of the thousands of chips, they have like almost a 90% failure rate. Now, does that mean that they're just being nasty to Russia, or is that they just don't have very good quality control? It's difficult to know. These are numbers that are quoted, but I don't have access to these chips. So I think that right now this might be a one way for the US is really at a very, very high level of trying to slow down this technology. Others have described this as possibly a Sputnik moment for China, that this will force them to accelerate, but we've seen them pour millions and millions of dollars into their chip development, and it hasn't gone as well as they would like. Nevertheless, as Peter mentioned, I mean, they have weapon systems that the United States doesn't even have. For example, the hypersonics. And so there's also, every military prepares for the last war, but this will be something very, very different. What we're seeing even now with use of drones has transformed war, and also it will be maritime, and so there are maritime drones, underwater drones. Also, we're seeing with this war, it's almost maybe historians will look back, it's maybe a run-up, a lot of movement about damaging we call it the battle of the bottom, so undersea cables. This is the key, and so this is something that China has mapped the floor very carefully. But one of the positive things that came out of the G20 pre-meeting is that Blinken is going to go to China. So this is very important. He's the Secretary of State, and if you think about it, he hasn't even been there yet. So it's really important, and I'm with Peter Frankopan 100%. It is a black box, and we've seen from when I lived there, it's not even half. It's so dramatically reduced. Journalists can't get visas. And there's a fantastic scholar from Princeton, Perry Link, who described it as the anaconda in the chandelier, this metaphor that you're sitting at your desk and there's a chandelier above you with this very horrible snake just looking down at you. And so it kind of imposes a form of self-censorship. And even now, I don't feel critical of journalists there because I understand we need at least some eyes on the ground. And if they're you have to really read carefully between the lines what they write, because they need to write that way in order to stay in China. So I think that it's just been decimated, the amount of journalists there, and the journalists who are there really almost write in coded language, and they have to soften their message. So we really have to pay close attention to what's going on. In addition, because of the COVID-19 restrictions, we don't even see many business people in China. It's becoming less and less attractive. And there are situations of elite capture. So there are certain companies, for example, Chancellor Scholz just visited Beijing shortly after the Chinese Communist Party meeting where Xi Jinping decided he had changed the constitution. Now he's going to be in power for another 5 years. Most likely he'll be in power for life. So this is something very similar to Putin. It's called managed democracy, but he's been around for about 22 years with the interim of Medvedev coming into power. So these are two leaders that actually have a lot in common in some respects. They're almost the same age. Putin recently turned 70, Xi Jinping is 69. They both grew up under these communist systems, and they have a lot of similarities in the way they see the world. So there are obviously a lot of differences, but the glue that holds them together is how they look at the West. The February 4th agreement was first time they put it down in writing about NATO, that they would join together because they didn't like what was happening with NATO. And in addition, Russia offered their support to China on Taiwan. So there is kind of this mutual interest, and their core interest would be supported. So, and don't want to get distracted here. I'm trying to pick up a lot of your points here. So, even though we're seeing, in my view, some rhetoric moving China away from Russia, I want to go back to the SCO meeting that Peter mentioned, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was the first trip that Xi Jinping took outside of China, most recently because of COVID. What was his first stop? The first place he went to was Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is key for China because of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And he announced it about 10 years ago in Kazakhstan. That's a key country for the land portion of the Belt and Road Initiative. I imagine all of you are familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative. Yes? and then there's the C component. So there's two roots of it. And the C route was announced in Indonesia. So anyway, he was in Kazakhstan, and there was a really pointed remark I think many people missed. Back in January, we saw the CSTO, this security organization that's run by China. So when Tokayev, the leader of Kazakhstan, was having some difficulties losing control of the country, who did he call? He didn't call China, he called Russia. They have a lot of cooperation from the past in military issues. And Putin came, brought the soldiers, managed to help Tokayev regain control of the country. Tokayev technically would owe him a favor, and then the Russian troops left. There's a huge Russian-speaking population in northeast Kazakhstan, which makes some of the leadership a bit nervous, because what happened with Ukraine, this idea of Novy Mir, that all Russian-speaking groups should all join back together and be part of this new type of Russia, made the leadership in Kazakhstan a bit neuralgic. So when Xi Jinping went there, what did he say? He didn't mention Putin, but he did say, China will guarantee your sovereignty to Kazakhstan. And that was a message that was very well received by Tokayev. And it was coded language that in this battle between Russia and China, these are countries that kind of understand and need to balance between Russia and China. And China's Belt and Road Initiative, ever since the demise of the Soviet Union, their security in this region has largely been described by investments. I think if these people have better economies, they will be less influenced by militant Islam. So their original idea was security means economic growth. And so the Belt and Road Initiative was part of this. So the first stop was Kazakhstan, then he went to the SCO. It was probably the worst possible time for Putin. Ukraine had made huge advances, and it was incredible because these Central Eastern European leaders, for example, the leader of Kyrgyzstan, kept Putin waiting. And that was like incredibly insulting for Putin. So Xi Jinping was carefully choreographing everything before the party meeting, and he knew he would have an attractive audience. Everyone would agree with what he had to say. He would get some deliverables and return. But Putin looked very weak at this point. And so the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is kind of a joint grouping, but this really came across as a China-controlled grouping. Even the limousines, the buses, they were all supplied by China, although the host was Uzbekistan. And if you recall, like this massive room where they had this meeting and all the leaders, if you look carefully, right behind everybody was a silk screen with bamboos painted on it. So it really had kind of a Chinese feel to it. So I would say that it was a huge win for Xi Jinping. He did that about several days before the meeting. He showed some deliverables, and he looked like he had important friends on the international stage. Because if you think about it, because of the tensions with Taiwan and other issues, he wasn't really perhaps welcome anywhere else for that at that level. So he filed it away as a win. All right, so with the party congress, I'm trying to pick up some of the points that you mentioned at the beginning. I'm sure all of you saw what happened with Hu Jintao being kind of gingerly taken off the stage. What does this mean? So we have to remember that before this all happened, everything was closed door. So they brought in all the journalists, and then this scene took place. So there are two narratives, and it's kind of a black box. We don't really know, but the two theories that are about why Hu Jintao, who is a former leader, was kind of removed, is that he's part of a faction that is no longer in power. Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with only people who are loyal to Xi Jinping. And so as Li Keqiang, the premier, is also part of this Chinese Communist Youth League, he has been ushered out of power. So when Hu Jintao, the narrative that some Chinese officials have said, he has dementia, he was having an episode, so he had to be removed. But I thought, if he really was ill, why would they wait until the cameras came into the room? I mean, it could be a plausible explanation, but that's one of the explanations. He was having a moment. And but he was kind of removed. He spoke to Xi Jinping, and then he spoke to Li Keqiang. So I hope that some lip readers can examine what he said, because that's pretty much key to what was going on. And there's various videos, and I have to admit I watched it probably far too many times, but one of the videos shows Li Shanzhi, who's the number 3 in the Chinese Communist Party, and he was like mopping his brow, like he was sweating profusely. So to my reading, he was very nervous about what was going on, how he was kind of being removed and taken away. And the key is the red file. So I don't know if you recall the photos, everyone had the red file, and inside the red file were all the new members of the Politburo and who was who in the, so when the former leader understood that there was going to be nobody from his faction, that this very much upset him. In addition, so Xi Jinping is kind of the winner now, right? So he doesn't have to worry about this inter-party democracy. He's surrounded by only people that are part of his faction and are loyal to him. For example, the former leader of Shanghai, who has been implementing these incredibly strong lockdown rules and regulations, which made people extremely unhappy, he was rewarded with a new role. So as long as people are loyal to Xi, they move up the ladder. Now, what does this sound like to you? What happened with the smile file with Putin? Do you remember when he had the meeting and his intelligence officer stood up and he was so nervous, she was kind of Putin was kind of making fun of him, and the intelligence official was kind of stumbling over his words, and Putin just was mocking him. Well, that's kind of a bad sign if your chief intelligence person can't speak frankly with you. So I think that there were some people in Beijing that are deeply concerned. They see what's happened with Putin making kind of dangerous decisions, and now Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with other smile file folks. So this could be a long-term danger as well. I would say that at this period of release, maybe not, but I think that there has been such strong response to China's behavior in the Taiwan Strait, and that she has no other choice but to kind of take it slow right now. Just to go back to Uzbekistan, I was there just recently for a conference after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization event. And I had been there 22 years earlier, and of course it's changed dramatically. When I was there, they were literally changing the exhibits in the museum because it was created by the Soviet Union and it was all against religion. So they were kind of reorganizing the museum when I was there. And now you have this prospect of what's going on in Xinjiang. So Xinjiang is key to the whole region. You might be, last night at dinner, at the table I was at, we were talking about the recent published UN report, which was extremely controversial. It took over 11 months to get it published. Some people said they just sat on it because of political reasons. China was pushing very, very hard not to have it published. And so when it was finally published, the Chinese version, their critique of it was published alongside it. And so they say it's all lies, it's not true. And the G word, genocide, was not mentioned at all. Some international lawyers have said there's 5 key issues on how to describe a genocide, and 4 of them meet these criteria. Nevertheless, that's a very, the UN didn't embrace that word. So it does bring a lot of attention, and the analysis that many people say is that businesses that are there will find it far more difficult now with the publication of this report to continue as business as usual. Certain companies like Volkswagen were asked to build a factory in Xinjiang. We know, Disney made a film there. They thanked the propaganda folks there for supporting them, and McKinsey had their infamous kind of 1,000 nights, red carpets on the sand dunes event there. I know previous speakers have mentioned some books that are really worth reading. Chapter 5 of the new McKinsey book on China is really worth your time. I highly recommend that, and how that works about elite capture. You also mentioned Hong Kong, Josh. So I just want to pick up on the Chinese narrative is one country, 2 systems. So the idea that Hong Kong could operate autonomously under this one country, 2 systems approach has been proven wrong with the NSL, the new security law. We've seen a steady stream of people leaving, and it's deeply concerning for those in Taiwan. They watched what was happening in Hong Kong, and this is why they are completely disillusioned with this idea of one country, two systems. So this also creates an environment in Taiwan where they see themselves less as Chinese and more as Taiwanese. And this is something that China is neuralgic about. They see it as a renegade province, and they feel that if we leave it too long, the younger generation will not identify with us. So maybe Xi will move sooner rather than later, but it's hard to know how his timing will be on that. All right, so you asked also to bring up about Europe and US. We see a real change in Europe. It's been long, they're far more highly dependent on trade with China. The key country is Germany. More than any other EU member state, they rely on trade with China. So this creates a form of dependence that can be exploited. There's also the issue of elite capture. We saw with the recent Schultz visit, he wanted to go talk about peace, but he kind of undermined his version by bringing so many business people with him. So in my view, it was kind of box ticking. He's part of a government of three parties, so he has to make everybody happy, but it was controversial before he left. The BDI, the German Federation of Industry, was really not blessing this trip. They were unhappy with it. And you even see the European Chamber of Commerce, their most recent report, and let's remember, they're cheerleaders for business in China, right? So the European Chamber of Commerce China is always trying to encourage people to go there. In their most recent report, which was published this summer, they were, okay.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, I'm going to have to go really fast here. They are saying that in China now, ideology trumps economics. So this is changing everything, and this is Xi's approach. We've seen that after the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, all these, China was in a terrible situation. So Deng Xiaoping had the famous saying, it doesn't matter if your cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So this was part of his kind of reform and opening up. We saw this kind of experimentation in China. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of visiting Shenzhen. I was there when it was just rice fields, and now it's just spectacular. And it's a place where everybody came from somewhere else in China. They had to create their own networks. It's a meritocracy, really, and hardworking and just incredibly innovative. But then you have other parts of China which are very different. So I think that this is kind of what was happening with reform and opening up. They were experimenting. They didn't want to have all these things going on across the country. They decided to be innovative and experiment with small regions. And if you look at the map, Shenzhen is just north of Hong Kong. So they were able to kind of benefit from the deep pockets of finance in Hong Kong and then to kind of move to Shenzhen. I am not, okay. So,
And that's only because we have such good questions coming.
All right, hold on. Keep
talking, we don't get any questions.
Okay. All right. So the other major story was about extraterritorial reach. I know you're all journalists, so I'm sure you've seen these stories about these kind of mysterious 30 Chinese police stations they've kind of discovered all over Europe. And people ask, well, if China has to renew people, what they're trying to do are they grab Chinese people that and send them back to China. So it's kind of extraterritoriality, and they're coming up with their own rules. And this is something that Europeans have kind of not been paying so close attention to, and then they wake up one day and wonder what's going on there. And the other thing, with the religion angle, I really want to pick this up. The cult of personality is something that everyone wanted to prevent in China after Mao. And so you had this kind of inter-party democracy, you have kind of 2 terms, and then you leave office, and Xi Jinping has turned all of that on its head. And he, in my view, will be around for a very, very long time. So after I moved away from China, I would go back every year for conferences or to take my kids there to have them practice Chinese. And what was really amazing to me was that it doesn't matter what small village you were in or what ancient temple, there was always a picture of Xi. So even if you went to a church, like where the crucifix would be, nope, there was a picture of Xi. So it's really an incredible cult of personality that they have been cultivating over the years. And during the Cultural Revolution, when he was sent down, so he lived in a cave, and for him, he was like a princeling. He was from the red aristocracy. These are the people who were along the trail, who marched all the way with Mao, and they survived. And so their parents are called red aristocrats because they're the part of the founding of People's Republic of China. And so these people have almost like special privileges. So it's kind of like mudbloods versus, this idea of you have like two. So the Chinese Communist Youth League were kind of the mudbloods, and then you have the red aristocracy in China. So you have these two groups competing against each other, and Xi Jinping has won. So it's the mudbloods are no longer involved. But anyway, so people go back now. There's like this hagiography that you couldn't go to the cave where Xi was sent as a young man during the Cultural Revolution, when he was sent to work in the countryside. And you can buy like a little mini shovel, and you can go into the field and dig where Xi once digged. And so it was kind of like, it's incredible. It's like this, they're really kind of cultivating all of this. And I was, he deliberately, it's almost impossible to know these stories because whatever he does is kind of turned into myth. And even when he was a young man and came, not that young, his first trip abroad was to the United States, and he went to Iowa. They were interested in farming and how to improve productivity. And so this nice Iowan family, their son had gone off to college, and it was Xi Jinping's first experience, and he stayed in this teenage boy's bedroom, which had posters of Star Wars in the wall. And you just try to imagine what was Xi Jinping thinking. And so this house has been bought by Chinese business people and is kind of turned into a museum. So other Chinese people can go there and see the house that Xi Jinping slept in when he first went to the United States. You referred to the pub in the UK where Xi had a drink, a pint of beer with his buddy Cameron during the golden era. Chinese go there, and like this pub is just, the locals are so angry because they can't have a drink there anymore because it's just filled with Chinese tourists, like, oh, Xi had a drink here. So it's kind of this cult of personality, and we really can see it. And I've got the plates, and but there's a couple other things I really need to pick up on here. You mentioned the investments in the Hamburg port. Now, let's keep in mind that Chancellor Scholz was the mayor of Hamburg. So the Chinese kind of cultivated him over the years. I'm sure he's got a few teapots in his house from Chinese trips, or they have this idea of talent spotting, cultivating good relationships. That's their secret weapon. They're really good at hospitality, and they call it talent spotting. So now he's chancellor, and most of the country was against the sale of the port to the Chinese. It's not like it's the first time. China went from 0, now they own 10% of ports in Europe. And so I have no problem with Chinese investing in things, but when it's commanding heights like port infrastructure or, electricity grids or nuclear plants in the UK, for example, I think that Russia, which is far weaker than China, and we've seen how they've weaponized energy, for example, we have to really think more strategically about this. And now it seems to be on the back burner, but the whole 5G debate that was taking place in Europe about Huawei, one of the things about being a member of NATO, you had to have secure communications. So the Huawei 5G communications would have been something that wouldn't have been perceived as responsible for NATO, that you couldn't have secure communications. They would have to create another system, a parallel system, which wouldn't make any economic sense. All right, I know about the time here, but I want to also mention at the SCO, and China does this all the time, right? So it's like deliberately ambiguous. And it's like a tabula rasa. So remember when Xi Jinping came to power, he talked about the China dream. So everyone was like, what does the China dream mean? They have conferences, everyone's like, what does he mean by this? What does it mean? So it almost generates conversation. So then we have the Belt and Road that was kind of, now we know better what it is about. And then now it's his 2 new initiatives that were announced are the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, and the GDI, the Global Development Initiative. These are, again, very opaque. We're not sure what they mean. People can kind of figure out what they want it to mean. But I think a global security initiative and a global development initiative, I think, are pretty ambitious on China's side. And I think we have to keep our eyes on this. And what does this mean? All right, I have to come back full circle about China-Russia, because many people wonder, will China throw Russia under the bus with their new rhetoric? What's happening? But my view is that what happened in 2014 in Crimea, in Ukraine was a key node for China on their Belt and Road Initiative. They had the biggest land deal in world history. They were buying grain from China. Food security is a huge issue for China. They were investing in pork. They were investing in the Crimean port to export all of this food. They were buying technology that the Russians wouldn't sell them. And also they were training, the Ukrainians were training PLA in China because that was part of the equipment. And the first aircraft carrier was sold to them from Ukraine. And of course, China didn't say, we're buying this aircraft carrier, because then they couldn't have towed it out, right, because of the Montreux Convention. So they said, we're going to turn it into a casino. And that's how they got their first aircraft carrier. So they said, we think it's a great casino. And they managed to bring it back, and everything was left perfectly intact. The seals, everything was, the US said, please remove all of the technology that if it's going to be turned into a casino. But the Ukrainians left everything intact, and that really helped China accelerate their military development. Another point I need to make is that because the US is becoming so strict on technology and restricting it to China, Europe is going to become the tech piggy bank. So the US is trying very hard to get Europe on board. There's the strategic autonomy debate that is growing in Europe. It is a time when Ukraine underspending on defense for the last 30 years has put Europe in a really weak position. And so China now, in my view, they've lost a lot of European support because they were seen as supporting Russia in the war with Ukraine. Technically, China's position is we're neutral, but we lean towards Russia. To me, that's a bit of an oxymoron. You can't be neutral and lean towards a country. So they have been telegraphing their messages. They've been magnifying it on their media. China has, especially in the global south, this has been extremely damaging. You find that Africa, South America, they tend to see the war framed in Russia's narrative, and China supports them that it's all NATO's fault, it's all the US's fault, they were left no choice but to invade. Okay, and Peter, because you're a classicist and you know Latin and Greek, I would just say that the Chinese have such an incredible amount of people. Like you were saying, how few people study Chinese. The Chinese are studying Latin, ancient Latin and Greek, in order to better understand the region. They have that type of resource. And I have to just add one more.
The region?
The reason?
They're studying Latin and Greek in order to study the region?
The Mediterranean.
Or the Mediterranean, here.
Because there is, Halford Mackinder is a geopolitical thinker. He wrote a paper in 1904, The Geopolitical Pivot of History. And there's a really important line in there, and I really think the Chinese take this seriously. He who controls Eastern Europe controls the world island, the heartland, this famous quote. So what did the Chinese do? About 10 years ago, they created the 16+1. So it's 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states. And you kind of think, well, why didn't you just do the EU or just do the other? But they combined the two together. And my initial impression was that they were kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and saw what was sticking. So the two countries that really stuck the most were Hungary and Serbia. Hungary is an EU member state, and Serbia is a possible accession state. I'm getting the cards up.
The cards up are a compliment. I mean, my suggestion is, maybe I can make one more point, but let's get to questions, because there's a fire hydrant of information on China, breaking forward. So yeah, one last.
Okay, I want to leave you with this thought. Okay. We know that Xi Jinping is very, very obsessed by the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin also said the biggest crisis of the last century was the demise of the Soviet Union. The Chinese have an institute in Beijing just to study the demise of the Soviet Union. So if they find a Gorbachev, a Chinese Gorbachev, they're going to take a hammer and nail him down. So I think that he's obsessed with why it failed and the issue of corruption. And China, as many people have understood, Xi Jinping kind of purged his enemies with corruption, but calling them corrupt, but almost anyone he could use that against. So I think that this kind of embrace of Russia and China, I have to just give this last quote from a Russian, because when I mentioned earlier about the big brother, little brother narrative, clearly now China is big brother, but Russia can't say that. So they say, we are big sister, which doesn't exist at all in Chinese thought. So they describe themselves as big sister because they can never say that they're little. So instead of perhaps being these two great powers, I would suggest that China must keep Russia in the tent rather than outside the tent. And what happened in 2014, they understood that Russia would block them at every point along the Belt and Road Initiative. That's why with what happened in Ukraine after China had worked so hard to cultivate Ukraine, they have to keep them in the tent. And in this, just pulling back at the bigger geopolitical picture, should there be, God forbid, a war in the cross straits between the US and China, China needs to have Russia in the tent rather than outside of it. And as you talked about Kissinger, I would call it kind of like a frustrated armchair Kissinger, this idea that we can try to pull Russia back into the US. It's not going to happen. And I think it's almost a misunderstanding of history. There was a 10-year gap between when Kissinger approached China and the break between Russia and China. But I'll leave it at that, and I'm sorry.
No, you did great. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. Okay, friends, if I could call us back to order. We'd like to sort of do a lightning round of conversation and questions. And we're going to start, if it works, with Tunku Rajan from the Wall Street Journal editorial board. Tunku, you're up with Peter and Teresa.
Hi, thank you. Those were brilliant talks. Aware that there's a long line of questions. Mine is a concise question, but it's also a sweeping one. Was the Kissinger-Nixon diplomatic opening to China in 1972, that tectonic event, a mistake? And what direction would history have taken if we hadn't opened up to China in 1972?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, hypotheticals and counterfactuals are very interesting, but one can go round in circles and convince oneself what one wants to hear. I mean, I suppose that sort of the context is that foreign policy has to be about pragmatism. And in that context, at the time of US heavily committed into Vietnam and facing limited progression with arms talks and a real concern about rising Soviet nuclear capabilities and ballistic missile capabilities in the late 60s in particular, there was sort of good reason to try to outflank Russia, or the Soviet Union rather. So I suppose that there was a process there around trying to be practical. And the problem about being practical is that it sacrifices long-term goals. I guess if I was a State Department official, I would say the US has done a pretty good job actually, and despite messing things up, there had to be reactions after 9/11. There are lots of reasons why interventions in the Middle East and Libya maybe things could have been even worse than they were. And I guess it is the question of how do you play a long game? And one of the sort of truisms about China is that somehow China plays a long game and is able to think strategically. I'm extremely skeptical about that, both from a practical point of view and from my experience, and also if one measures outcomes, that China has built a big economy, but on stilts that are very wobbly. And like I said, it's in the talk, its engagement with other parts of the world have been conspicuously bad at winning long-term friendships, although, as I say, there are lots of parts of the world where the Chinese have been more resilient and better at doing that than where we are. So specifically, was Kissinger wrong? I mean, I probably betrayed by quoting him, reaching out after Tiananmen Square. I probably have a slightly more sanguine view of Kissinger's role as a global theorist than many of my colleagues do. What would have happened differently? I suppose it signaled to the Chinese that we were ready to do business on pragmatic terms, and and that we say one thing and do another. I mean, that's a really important theme today. So, for example, Teresa mentioned about Uyghurs, and there's been a lot in the press. You guys have all written about that. Basically, starting in 2020. I mean, the Uyghur camp started in 2017. It was almost impossible to get any coverage in mainstream media. By the time it sort of started to become a significant part of the debate and public profiles, lots of that had moved on in China already in terms of where those camps started to be disassembled and moved on. But what is interesting is that although there's been a lot of focus on Uyghurs and on Xinjiang, in 2021, British imports from Xinjiang province went up by 200%. Dutch, German, French imports all went up by 150%. And what that tells me, if I was sitting in Beijing, is that you'll talk about human rights, but actually you want the cheapest pair of sneakers you can buy. And if they get made in the wrong conditions, we don't really ask too much about that. And that was summarised. I haven't drunk my second cup of coffee, so I can't remember who the chief executive of Volkswagen was when he was asked about assembling Volkswagen cars in Xinjiang and was asked about the use of coerced labour. And he said, look, we just don't want to get involved in these kinds of questions or discussions. We just want the cars built as cheaply and as quickly as we can. The
Volkswagen number 2.
Volkswagen, yeah.
There's some incredible footage online. I think it was a BBC journalist, and the representative from Volkswagen just acted like, what? What? There's something going on here.
I think he was the CEO. Yeah, I think he.
The journalist got him saying it like, no, I didn't know anything about forced labor.
Yeah, so it's a long answer to your supposed easy question, Tunku, but I think it's that the way which we do things tends to solve today's problems without thinking about what that might store up in the future.
Okay, all right, I'll just, I just had the Nuri Turkal, who is a Uyghur activist, and I just met him last week in Brussels. He came to speak to the European Parliament, and he reminded me that he was born in a camp. So he was born in a camp in Kashgar in 1971. His grandfather was being held. So they had camps that go back very far. So he was actually born in a camp. He went to the US to become a lawyer, and he's now a huge human rights advocate. So this has been going on. They've built many more since then, and it's, we can see through satellite data that they've really increased it dramatically. So back to your question about Kissinger. On Nixon's deathbed, you know what he said, reportedly? Have we created a Frankenstein? When he was talking about China. So on his deathbed, he appeared to have regrets. And I studied with John Mearsheimer. I don't agree with everything he says, but one of the things he did say was, no empire in history has helped their competitor so much. So you had all this US investment in China, all of these kind of wishful thinking when they joined the World Trade Organization, that gave China such a massive leg up. And they thought if we hug them close enough, then they'll be like us. But all they did was kind of help an authoritarian regime. They've enriched an authoritarian regime. And can you imagine if Stalin had the type of surveillance equipment that China has today? And with Uzbekistan, I'll just give you one example, because this is a country that has the surveillance equipment. So when they picked me up at the airport, I'm sitting in the taxi, and I could see in the rearview mirror, it says Lenovo, and it was filming me the whole time. So I was taking photos because I hadn't seen that before. And then when I got to my meetings, they take your picture, you sign in, and your face is your ticket, and then you go, it sees your face, and then it lets you through the turnstile. So I could see, this type of surveillance in Uzbekistan. So in the past, we would say Russia was the rifle and China was the purse. Yeah. But now that purse is full of surveillance equipment, and this is something that Russia can never compete with. And so this idea of Russia, China balancing out in Central Asia, I would say that China and their ability to do all this surveillance has transformed the region. But going back to your question about Vietnam and the US are so close now. And the Vietnamese will say, that was the biggest mistake the US ever made, that they turned to China, because China and Vietnam are obviously enemies. But I mean, history has turned out very differently than people would have ever imagined back in the 70s. The US is actually kind of helping helping Vietnam with sea, they're trying to help them in the South China Sea. And everyone's nightmare is when a Chinese oil rig pulls up off the coast of Vietnam. So I think that they make back in the 70s, no one could have envisioned the type of relationship the US has with Vietnam. But I would say that Mearsheimer has also said that the US, the Chinese narrative is like, you're trying to contain us, you're trying to hurt us, but no power in history has helped their rival grow so dramatically. There are still, even with all of this kind of China-US tensions, so many Chinese students that still study in the United States. So I think that it's an unusual situation to be in, but I would say that the idea that I think it's in Kissinger's interest to portray what he did as so magnificent, but I think maybe future historians might see it very differently.
Just add to it, because you mentioned surveillance a couple of times. Just for context, which is not a
I know London has more
relativist. In London, we have 940,000 surveillance cameras, so 1,500 per square mile.
Yeah.
Right. So surveillance is not unknown in the Western world too.
Sure.
And in fact, one of the questions that we should all be asking is what do we do about data that is sold rather than data that is state gathered? And there's a kind of understanding that states are dangerous because how they use and process data and keep people in place. There's no question about that. But we have a whole set of questions that are parallel mirror images that we should be also not parking.
No,
as a
I'm
good-
aware of
Good,
that.
good. But the
Because-
number in China, they say, what is it? The commission that Nuri's on, they talk a lot about,
Yeah.
1.4 billion people, about 710 million cameras. About 1 per 2 people. Is that about?
Yeah, there are 3 million people in China whose job is to monitor internet traffic. 3 million people. That's a lot of reports being produced on a daily basis and weekly basis.
Let's turn, if we can, to Marine Cant from the Times. Yes, cheers.
Thanks both very much. That was amazing. Peter, on your question about whether Xi's, whether the threats that he perceived or real, is the idea that we're moving into an age of deglobalization a threat for China, or has it already positioned itself in a way where it is accelerating this trend? So the idea that the global economy, maybe more so after this war, will fracture into regional blocs. You'll see this idea of friendshoring, companies moving into areas where they have to assess geopolitical rivalries and alliances. How does China fit into that context? We already know that it might benefit countries like Mexico, who could take a lot of the cheap labor share that China has been traditionally producing. And the last time we had a financial crisis, China basically bailed everyone out by doing one of the most incredible fiscal stimuluses that we'd ever seen. That's not happening this time around. They're not going to be doing something of that nature. The regional lockdowns show that China's much more concerned about other priorities and coming to the rescue of the West, whether it was a secondary consequence of what happened in 2008 and 2009. It's now no longer, that silver bullet's not going to happen for the West anymore. Does that also change? Is that an active way that China thinks about its role in the global economy, because it knows how important and influential it is to bail out the rest of us? Just on the Uyghurs, what's the narrative that the Communist Party of China has constructed around the Uyghur threat, what this community represents, what they are trying to achieve? And is also the great skill, I don't know if you could call it skill, of the Chinese, not that they've managed to convince a lot of Western companies that ultimately they just care about trade and having cheap goods, but also that a lot of the Muslim world is also now has actively turned a blind eye to this, and the traditional, what you would think, voices of people wanting to defend Muslims around the world have also shown that blind eye. And how has China managed to do that? And was that even a calculation that it knew would happen? The fact that, we already mentioned Imran, but Imran Khan usually says, I'm just not really well read on the subject and I haven't really looked into it enough to, every time a journalist asks him about what's going on in Xinjiang, he can claim this sort of ignorance. And has that also been a skill of Chinese diplomacy to ensure that a lot of the countries that should have been speaking out of this issue are also been pretty supine on this topic?
How about if Peter takes global economy and you take the Uyghurs
Okay.
narrative?
Okay, great questions. So China's role in the globe, as all of you know, backwards, is deeply embedded and asymmetric. So China is very independent for its own domestic markets on the global economy, but highly integrated into all of our supply chains, as you know. So there obviously is a balance with these things of Chinese investments in US treasuries, China's requirement for people to buy electronics, kit, sofas, whatever it is that gets made in China. So any global slowdown impacts China and its manufacturing sector. One of the bite points and the difficulties has been that, apart from the geopolitical stuff that we possibly overemphasize and over-worry about, is this about Trumpism and fragmentation and whatever. It's about much more nuts and bolts logistics. So average pay for Chinese manufacturing workers in the electronics sector tripled between 2010 and 2020. So the reason for businesses like Apple and Google to offshore, or reshore rather, is not just because there's pressure from the State Department or it's part of a big global meltdown. It's if your costs are rising very quickly, which is a substantial overhead, at what point do you look to Vietnam, Mexico, other parts of the world? The supply chain issue around, because of COVID and port congestion and whatever, has been added extensively to costs. So it's not just about sort of big picture questions. I mean, I guess the sort of one of the sort of moments that's been most surreal over the last few years has been watching, in the Trump administration, America pull back from global affairs in all sorts of ways, putting up trade barriers, trying to sort of blow up the system from the inside, which was not entirely, in the case of China, not entirely surprising. I mean, Trump, in the madness, there were some things that Trump was right about, which is hard to kind of concede for lots of obvious reasons. But Trump wasn't wrong, for example, about NATO's expend, wasn't wrong about dependence on gas, but also wasn't wrong about rebalancing the Chinese trade system, or China's role with US trade. And from the Beijing perspective, there was real openness, I think, to try to work out how to solve that. The recognition there was a problem, recognition of problem, IP theft and whatever was an issue. The question was how to solve that in a way that was meaningful. And the real problem that the Chinese authorities had dealing with Trump was he kept changing his mind. And that was what was really difficult. So the Chinese, I think, worked out, I think, that the narrative around all these things was that China was a dependable partner and the United States was volatile and erratic. Climate change, pulling out of UNESCO, UNIDO, pulling out of human rights at the UN. And so seeing Xi at Davos talk about globalization being good for everybody and common prosperity, and China was the champion of global free trade at the time the United States was pulling back from it, was a kind of surreal moment where a Marxist-Leninist state is the champion of greater levels of exchange and the home of the greatest, most open economy on earth, saying that we should do things in a different way and pull up the drawbridge. You need to have quite a strong constitution to follow what is the rhetoric and what is the reality. But things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was built as a kind of US big free trade bloc in Asia Pacific that then Trump decided to pull out of, slightly in a fit of pique, opened up a world where, again, we don't spend enough time thinking about it. There is still hyperglobalization across ASEAN countries and across Southeast Asia and across East Asia. And how we see fragmentation, how the IMF sees fragmentation from the point of view of the West looks very, very different. So, I think that there are lots of strands running in different directions around what that means. And it's, I think, first to follow the data and follow the logistics rather than the kind of high-level PowerPoint presentations around, is this a changing world order? It's where are goods made, where are they bought, and what happens when there are compressions on food supply. For example, in most of the parts of the world I work on, wheat is bought as animal feed. So it has a different dynamic to food shortages and exports from Ukraine. When it's a rice-based diet, there's very little food inflation in most countries in East Asia. Energy is a slightly different story, and that's not just about Russia and oil and gas. That's around the weather this summer, and about 20% of China's energy is produced from hydroelectric. Sichuan province, 80% is HEP, is hydropower. And when there's too much heat and the waters evaporate and the hydro plants fail, factories in Chengdu were shut for 2 weeks, regardless of what they made. So those kinds of things paint a slightly different picture about what it is that the world looks like. And it's perhaps less involved with Washington, less involved with EU, less involved with what the West is doing, but a whole set of different factors around how do you keep markets moving, and whether there'll be, the bailout now looks slightly different, because I think the Beijing view of the West is that we've got a system of problems that are going to be too hard for us to solve, and probably this time around a bit of pain may not be a bad thing. They've been talked into that by Moscow, with that relationship I'm sure we'll talk about. China's carried a lot of water for Moscow promising that they know what's going to happen in Ukraine and are going to bloody the nose of the West, NATO, and so on. And so the junior partnership doesn't look quite so simple to me, that Russia gets pulled along. Russia pulled China through into a series of problems that I suspect that I can't speak about because I can't get there. And anyway, people stopped talking to me over COVID, talking to everyone over COVID. This looks like quite a serious set of problems coming towards China. And you can, if you see it that way around, that maybe then looks at the purging of the Politburo, making sure you're absolutely reliable, keeping COVID restrictions that keep people in place may have a context that's not just about disease and health. It's about trying to keep the pot on a pot that is bubbling quite hot.
All right. I just would like to add that Xi Jinping, in regard to deglobalization, I mean, the China price is over. You know, they have a shrinking labor force, the cheap prices, that's why they have a lot of slave labor in some of these camps. But anyway, dual circulation is what Xi Jinping wants. So in a nutshell, it's to make the world more dependent on China and China less dependent on the world. So they want this built-in dependency. And so there are some companies that are already captured by the market. They've had huge investments. For example, I would say the 3 German ones are Siemens, Volkswagen, and BASF. And then you see a sucking sound of other German companies leaving because it's hard to repatriate profits. You have to have a Chinese Communist Party member on your board. You can't take data out of the country with you. So there's lots of issues about doing business in China. But these big companies, which always seem to get the headlines, are attracting this attention. And today, BlackRock, one of the biggest investors, they are reducing. And they're laying off people who work only on Chinese investments. So I don't know if we've hit bottom yet on that, but I think we're kind of maybe starting to see the bottom of the crisis, the economic crisis in China. You're a journalist, I'm sure you've seen some of these great stories. There was a little girl in Britain writing her Christmas cards, and inside the Christmas card there was a message like, I am held in a camp in Xinjiang, and please help, please let everyone know about this. Or there was another one in the US with Halloween tombstones, these like tombstones people had, and it was like a secret message from a person in Xinjiang saying, I'm being forced to make these things, I'm being held against my will. These people are getting the messages out. But I haven't heard any stories like that in a while, so I wonder if they've even cracked down on those types of things. So you asked about the Uyghur threat. It's really interesting because they don't have guns, obviously, but they have knives. So every knife is kind of got this mark on it that's, like an electronic mark. So if anyone is ever attacked with a knife, they will go back to the person who bought that knife and has the mark on it. So that's the level of control. And I mean, it sounds so sensational, but the Chinese were working so hard that they would implant like a Chinese member into the Uyghur family. So if they were fasting or if they were praying, they would be reported on. And so it's almost mind-boggling what's happening there. So the other issue, we saw the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. It was proposed 2 years ago before Merkel was leaving office, and it was supposed to promote ILO, like the International Labor Organization rules, which China has not signed up for yet. And this was how Europe was saying we were going to help China become more labor compliant to international standards. Well, what's happened now, because I was just in Uzbekistan, I'll share the story with you. Uzbekistan has done the hard work. They've removed like child laborers from picking cotton because it's such an odious job. And so we saw with the sanctions and then the counter-sanctions, because the Europeans, with the Magnitsky Act that they had been fighting off for years, they finally passed it, and then they had like sanctioned 4 very low-level Chinese officials in regard to Xinjiang. So the Chinese responded with massive counter-sanctions, sanctioning members of the European Parliament, one from each party, so they got everybody angry, the whole entire political and security, diplomatic community, MEPs, academic think tanks, an entire think tank in Germany was sanctioned because of this. So my point is that this is something very neuralgic for China, and that if you try to sanction them, you will be counter-sanctioned. And so the whole idea of the cotton sanctions, H&M, various European companies said we're not going to use this slave labor cotton from Xinjiang. And so China kind of said, fine, we're not going to let you sell that any of that cotton t-shirts that you manufacture in China. So it's this idea of leverage. China has such a huge market, and this means they have leverage. And so companies are coming up with Chinese walls, literally. I mean, they have like one company that has to be incorporated only in China, and then they have an international market, and they try not to keep those markets separate. So I don't know how that's going to work out.
So we've got 9 questions, and the facts, just to put it before you, are that we will have buses showing up here at 11:50. Okay. And lunch ready for us around 12. Now, it could be a little bit late, it's fine. But let's see if we can go a little crisper to get everybody in if we can. Mara Gay, you're up next from the editorial board at the New York Times.
Thanks. Hi, guys. I'm a journalist, not an intellectual, so forgive the practical nature of this question. But in your specific personal view, what is the responsible way for those of us invested in the survival of liberal democracy to approach China?
You need short answers.
You're an academic. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the bottom line is to accept higher prices.
You mean literal higher prices
Yeah.
or metaphorical higher
China, I suppose, take as a whole, the global south, China specifically, has allowed, has placed huge deflationary measures on wages and on the cost of goods and created climate damage. So it's not just about human rights and so on, but the fetishism for wanting economic growth at all costs with the least possible consequences, we probably reached the end of the road. So it means higher prices, cost of goods, and a different form of engagement with capitalism, but you can't have everything. And so the engagement with China means not being a sucker for goods made in states where you have humanitarian objections, but you still buy their goods while raising it like Rishi Sunak will do and slapping on the wrist but not doing anything about it.
I don't know about you, but like COVID taught me how little I need, because I just lived in sweatpants and gym shoes and wore different t-shirts during COVID. So 60% of the German population said that they were willing to accept higher prices if it meant that there would be more justice, and especially in regard to Russia and China. So I think that that's a promising sign. All right, there's 40% that don't. But the other thing, I have to keep this short and sharp, Google document 9. Okay, this is a leaked document, and it's what China is most fearful of. So there's 7 points, but one of the key points is they are against universal values. And they say this is an evil thing that the West has devised, and that this is something that will undermine the Chinese Communist Party. So Google, document 9, it was leaked. Someone decided to make sure everyone got to see that. But I think that it is a systemic rivalry. I'm sorry, it's a very, very different system. And China is changing us. We're not changing China. When they were allowed to join the World Trade Organization, remember President Clinton said, you can't nail Jello to the wall. So that he thought that the internet would change everything, China. Well, no, they've learned to control the internet, and they're actually maximizing our systems against us and undermining our democracies. So I would say that their best strategy was to convince everyone they didn't have a strategy, and now we're kind of in a mess.
Tim Alberta with The Atlantic.
Another just very direct question, like Mara, it feels like the elephant in the room here vis-a-vis the new Cold War is Taiwan and this activity in the South China Seas. And you have these two economic superpowers, but it feels different from the US relationship with Russia during the Cold War because we both need each other economically, at least elites in these two countries need each other economically. Can either of you, there was this situation a couple of years ago where one of the NBA team executives tweeted out his support, I'm sure you all remember, and then LeBron James, arguably the most recognizable person on the planet, sort of personally walked it back and said, of course we meant no offense to the Chinese government. And it's this very eye-opening moment that I think demonstrates the degree to which elites in both countries very much need one another. Can either of you conjure a scenario where there would be a military conflict between these two nations?
It's a slightly different question. I thought you were going to ask about Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which I'm in a very small minority, but I think the chances are extremely small. I think it suits everybody to talk this up. So I'm very highly negative. Is there a chance of a wider potential outbreak for other causes? Well, there are, like the Rand Corporation has modelled what a conventional first strike by the United States on the Chinese economy would do. There's been sort of considerable military planning around what a confrontation might look like, and when you have militaries who think about that and plan it, that's probably part of the problem. So is there a chance things could go wrong? You don't need to take my opinion on it. On the 6th of January last year, General Milley, the commander of the Joint Chiefs, rang his opposite number in Beijing at the PLA and said if he was ordered to launch conventional, non-conventional strike on China, he would try to give them 30 minutes warning. And if you're sitting in Beijing, that probably makes you slightly worried about not just American intentions, but about volatility. So is there a spark where something like that could happen? There's no controls on the Commander-in-Chief of the US Army and ability to launch nuclear missiles or to start wars. That's a right that the President has under the Constitution, which is not how we do things in the UK. It means that there's all sorts of scope for things to go wrong, with the rush of blood to the head, misunderstandings, poor military intelligence. In the grand scheme of things, would this play out in a kind of linear way where temperatures get hot? I would guess probably not, but as a historian, I can tell you that the whole point of history is that wars always break out. It's just a question of when.
Okay, I'll try to keep it really short and sharp. Everyone is so divided on this. This morning I got up and read everything I could get my hands on. So Foreign Affairs, there was just an article that was published last night saying that there's kind of a period of détente right now between Russia and China. Victor Shi published a paper yesterday saying we're on the cusp of war. So even experts are divided on this, and it's not very clear.
Between China and Taiwan.
Like over Taiwan. So everyone likes to say Cold War 2.0, and I really don't like that, because I think that that almost makes us feel complacent. This is far more complicated than the Cold War. The Cold War is going to look like a cakewalk. We are so, we've got so many players. It's really very, very difficult. So Taiwan, I don't even want, people didn't believe that there was going to be a war in Ukraine, right? So the US showed all the intelligence, the Chinese took the intelligence and gave it to the Russians. I mean, that's, even Europeans, they had the Munich Security Conference just days before the actual invasion. And the US was showing people on the sidelines the intelligence, and everyone's like, no, it will never happen. So I don't know if that's like an optimism bias. No one wants to think about the horrible, but I think what we should take away from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or increased war since 2014 in Ukraine, is that we have to start trying to imagine the unimaginable. I don't have real estate inside Xi Jinping's head, but he has a lot of issues. The economy's tanking. He has a demographic issue. Things aren't going very well, and we know from history when things go rather pear-shaped, and he's kind of rattling, about what's going on with Taiwan. Is that just optics? He's made it quite clear at the last Party Congress that Taiwan, Taiwan, Taiwan. And I don't know, I mean, Chinese historic approach to military is like to win without fighting. So they were doing very well as long as the Kuomintang, the KMT, was in power in Taiwan. It was getting closer and closer to China. The Taiwanese are huge investors in China. But now, after what happened with Hong Kong, Tsang won, the current leader won overwhelmingly, because people are like, we don't want to be like Hong Kong. So the dynamic has changed. We see how difficult war is in Ukraine, even with Russia. It will be much harder in a sea. Having amphibious, it would be horrible. But Taiwan has been very clever. They've made themselves so valuable in terms of chips. So it's chips and democracy. Let's see if that works. But I would say that we can see even really key experts in the U.S. are divided. So I don't have any clear answer on that.
Yeah, and human error is what brings down airliners, right? So navigation error on a Chinese jet or an American aircraft carrier jet, patrol that has a contact while we're sitting here, escalating what happens after that, it's a question of choice. It's about who does it suit. And one of the things that's difficult is to see how hard-line the PLA is in terms of decision-making in Beijing. She is very much a product and I wouldn't say in the hands of the PLA, but it's very closely aligned. And the hawks and the doves in Beijing have been that filtration. So anything can go wrong. The Franz Ferdinand moment of a single event where suddenly it suits everybody to escalate. Those fragilities are much more serious in a way than the kind of Putin planning what he's going to do and then having a very conventional war and then running it badly. So we should be aware, I think, of the fracture possibility of a small incident suddenly running out of control, which hasn't been modelled, decisions made badly in real time, misunderstandings. And those channels of communication have to be kept, they've been done quite well between Moscow and Washington in the last 6 months during the war. It didn't work to start with, but right now I think that there is some back channels that work relatively well in terms of setting out what those red lines might look like. But those breakdown of communications with China have been almost total in the last 2 to 3 years because of Trump and now COVID.
That's good. Let's go to Tom Nuttall, if we can, from The Economist.
Thank you. I had two questions, but I'll just ask one. Just to ask you both to dig in a little bit more detail to something that you both hinted at in various answers that you've given, and that's the internal weaknesses that are confronting the Chinese economy. Theresa, a moment ago you mentioned demographics, and this looks pretty serious to me. Huge holes in parts of the banking system, the property meltdown that you see in some places, and then some of the external threats that Peter you touched on a moment ago, sort of long-term wage rises making the Chinese manufacturing sector much less competitive, and at least in the short term, obviously, the huge difficulties that they're having getting out of the zero COVID policy. Could you briefly provide, I don't know, sort of a taxonomy of these things, how serious you think they are, and to what extent you think that they might affect China's ability to project power externally in the long term?
Demography, internal weaknesses.
Can I just wanted to make a quick comment about the previous question.
I mean, it's like being on TV. You can say whatever you want.
All right, it's like policy planners used to call it the decade of concern, right? And now we've seen head of Pacific Command say, the invasion could take place in 2022 or 2023. Well, I'm sorry, this is the end of November, it's November 2022. So the narrative has changed very dramatically from the US side, from a decade of concern to maybe 2022, 2023. To your question about internal weaknesses, most economists are extremely worried. We can see how the investment industry is behaving. Everyone used to think they would have a safe job at Goldman Sachs if they were working on Chinese investments. Now those people are being laid off. So that's speaking volumes. The Chinese themselves, the rich people are trying to leave. They're voting with their feet. It's getting harder and harder to leave with your assets. So they're stuck. And I am deeply concerned about these things because when things go so pear-shaped, what can you do? If they could take Taiwan bloodlessly, I'm sure she would do it, because that would change everything. Because of the law of the sea, all of this, they would strangle Japan and South Korea. They could control their energy exports there. The whole geography would change. The US would lose their face because they couldn't support their allies in the region. So if I was Xi and things were looking a little dodgy, I think I would think about it. The only good thing about the war in Ukraine, in my view, the only upside, is that it might give Xi Jinping some pause, because the narrative coming out of Beijing is the West is in decline, the East is rising. And so when they saw the West kind of group together, even neutral Switzerland put sanctions on Russia, no one dreamed that would happen. And I think that was a big shock both to Xi and Putin. So I think that's maybe the upside, and that Xi has to kind of recalculate that there would be sanctions. Nevertheless, some German industrial figures have said, we could never put sanctions on China. So, I mean, it seems like the West is already fragmenting on this issue, but I would say that this gives Xi pause for concern, but he has a very small window of opportunity. They actually have more ships than the United States. When the US starts focusing, they will be laser-like, and right now they're kind of at sea. There has been a lot of elite capture even within the US, even within the Biden administration, there's competing voices on China. So I would say, that there's a very small window now for Xi, I think.
Well, domestic economy, again, number one, betting on China getting it wrong. There's a big industry that's predicted the blow up of China for, as you know, for 20, 30 years. And so far the Chinese managed to stay ahead of that. But staying ahead of a wave that's coming, doesn't, I guess eventually it catches you. And it looks to me that the systemic problems are enormous right now, and probably more serious than they have been since '92. And part of that is about some of the things you mentioned, the real estate bubbles, the debt, the whatever. Part of it is that the expansion of the Chinese workforce to build infrastructure, and there's railway lines and bridges and motorways and whatever. There is a finite number of things you need. One of the mayors of Sichuan province said, we've got as many bridges as we could ever possibly want. So it's the transition from low to middle income country transition is really difficult, to go from manufacturing to services, and very few countries have managed to do that successfully. South Korea, Mexico, Turkey. You can cut your cloth whichever way, but none are with a population of 1.4 billion people. So it's difficult to see whether that next chapter is achievable, particularly in the context of COVID, particularly in the context of sanctions and resource shortages of specific components like semiconductors. And as you say, the banking, the real estate bubbles, jobs, lack of foreign direct investment, which is pushing downwards, and also the Chinese state companies, and notionally private companies have been quite successful raising money on the New York Stock Exchange and Hong Kong and elsewhere, and that looks like now that has come to an end of the injection of capital. So if the US are able to impose more of the kind of grip around the throat, you can see that there is a potential very serious set of problems coming towards China. And the question then is, how does Marxism-Leninism, as well as Xi's characteristics, try and solve those? And I guess in the first instance, the way you solve that is by not doing the same things that the Soviet Union did in the late 80s. You don't reform. You don't allow freedoms. You don't allow people to express themselves, because the ways they express themselves will almost exclusively be detrimental and will be questioning your model. So will the wave run over and bring down the dam? Like I said, people have always been predicting that. I would say that Chinese central bankers and thinkers, although they spend a lot of time studying Marx, they're not stupid, and they're aware of what those problems are. The question is, in authoritarian regimes, can the right ideas reach the top, and will the person at the top make good decisions? And you can look at Putin, Mark Zuckerberg, whoever you like, to see that people at the top of institutions, they can get things really wrong. But probably these last 30 years have been a lesson in Beijing being quite good at times of crisis. Like Mehreen said in 2008, whether they will always get it right, I guess like airline crashes, pilot error is always going to be involved. But I don't know whether this is that moment or not.
Can I just add one thing?
Yep, and then we're going to go to Christine O'Krent from, but quick.
There's the talk of the middle income trap, and that's classic, and they will get old before they get rich. And the level of inequality in China, the Gini coefficient, it's illegal to even publish it in China. They don't even want people to know how unequal they are. So I think probably the most telling thing, if you want it in a nutshell, the fact that Li Keqiang, who is actually pretty good at economics, he's been retired. And she is like, it's ideology over economics. I think that speaks volumes.
Christine.
Thank you. One question to Peter. You brilliantly explain how wrong or short-sighted we've been in the West about China. And the truism goes that China has always a long-term view. Would zero COVID prove exactly the reverse, or would you actually explain to us that indeed Xi Jinping has a zero COVID long-term view, or does zero COVID prove quite to the contrary?
I don't know, but what my guesswork is that zero COVID for the first year of the pandemic was a real feather in China's cap, the way in which China looked like it had solved it in a way when we in the West, the wheels were coming off left, right and centre. That now looks very different after successful vaccine rollout and so on, and China's own Sinovac not being effective. My guess will be that what we're looking at in China right now is not just about disease environments. It's not just about COVID. It's about keeping people in their cities and in their apartments, in their place, at a time of macroeconomic compression. I don't have any ability to look through that. I've got no idea about the data on Chinese current. I mean, it's significant that BioNTech went with Schultz to China and obviously have licensed the vaccine for Chinese markets. But I would suspect it's not as simple as just zero COVID and the whole Communist Party competence rests on that, because Chinese citizens, and they're very young, they're able to get maybe not past every VPN, but they're not completely cut off from the outside world. They're able to see that we're moving around, and that they're not. And there are lots of leaps of faith to think that Chinese citizens will just do what they're told and are happy as long as they get richer and more prosperous, which is quite hard if you're staying at home and your productivity falls. So my guess would be that there's more to the zero COVID than just about medical competence and healthcare. It's about other things that are going on behind the scenes. But that like I said, requires a few leaps of faith and quite a bit of guesswork in the absence of being able to know what's going on the ground.
Let's go next, if we can, to Emma Tucker with the Sunday Times.
Okay, two questions. Number one, the pandemic. We haven't really spoken about it. So trust was not exactly great between China and the West already.
Trust. Sorry.
Then along comes the
She's
pandemic,
gone.
and you're obsessed.
Sorry. Yeah, trust. So sorry. Yeah.
But we still haven't established the origins of the coronavirus.
Right.
You know, Western scientists weren't given access to the labs. The lab leak theory was allowed to proliferate.
Yeah.
And there's almost certainly going to be another pandemic that may well originate from China. So what should we be doing now about that?
Okay.
The second thing I have to ask is, after the Congress in Beijing, the one characterization of that Congress was a sea of men. There was literally, I think, one woman in about how many. Now, it's a dictatorship, China, but it doesn't exist in a bubble. It's not hermetically sealed. Women in China must see that elsewhere in the world, we're not perfect, but elsewhere in the world, women are making strides in a way that they possibly aren't in China. I'm just curious to know what, if any, kind of feminist movement there is in China, and how effective is it?
Okay, there's a fantastic book about women in China, which I will refresh myself afterwards. You're right. There's not one member of the Politburo and none on the Standing Committee. Not one. The Chinese in the last decade were quite active in trying to say that 50% of business directors are women, and that there are higher levels of participation in the workforce, etc. So it was a badge of difference that was waved around quite a bit, and that's gone very quiet. What ability there are for women to break through the tone deafness of manels from top to bottom, it's really striking in a world where there are very different modalities, and women play a very important role in Chinese societies and don't have repressions in the same way that that minorities do, for example. So their absence and their washing out of leadership positions is very, very striking. How that might get fixed, why that's happened, I will direct you to someone who's much more knowledgeable about that than me, but it's a very good and important observation, I think, around what does that mean for a society which is aging, becoming older, more male because of the imbalance of genders anyway, and typically societies that have that imbalance of distribution tend to be more trigger happy when it comes to testosterone and use of force and aggression and so on, although that's a blanket statement. Pandemic, well, I'm many things, but I don't work in genomics, but a friend of mine who runs the UK genomics programme, the co-director, I think is absolutely satisfied that this was a naturally occurring vaccine and non-tampered. How it was released, when did the Chinese authorities know what was going on? Were flights kept open to make sure we all went down in flames? I don't know, but I know how all bureaucratic communistic states work, which is always bet on incompetence rather than genius, evil plans. So, I think that Tony Fauci, again, no reason to doubt the maths and the science, which not my expertise, is that naturally occurring things, if they're in the wild, they will jump over anyway. And I can't remember whether I said that this morning or last night, but there's a new coronavirus that establishes every day. And so the way in which we are with the climate stuff coming towards us, there are about 600 emerging infectious diseases, and about 75% of those are highly sensitive to climatic changes, almost all of them to warming. Some diseases become more virulent when we cool, but almost all of them through warming. So for sure we're going to be in environments where pandemics come towards us again. I would hope that we've learned a few things from this one. We've learned a little bit about, that it's okay to be locked up. You've learned how to sort of work out, you've got to work to see what's going on. We rolled out vaccines quite quickly. The missing link with the vaccine, with pandemic, was the total lack of role played by digital technology companies, that should have been absolutely central in our responses, of being, every single person on Earth more or less has at least one smart device, and how tech refused to get involved in, or didn't get involved in, being part of that early warning system was important. But China, as Teresa will be able to tell you, is very active in the Silk Roads of healthcare. Was something that has replaced. China is not building roads and factories and stuff in CPEC. They're not doing the stuff they said they were doing with the Belt and Road 5 years ago. They pulled funding in 2018, more or less. And the Belt and Road became now about sharing information, knowledge, oral hygiene, those kinds of things. But the healthcare is the one that is the most important one, because everyone's highly receptive. So it's how do you diagnose, how do you solve, how do you share information, how do you roll things out? And I thought we've probably learnt some pretty good lessons from that. I think we are very good in the West at breaking things, messing it all up, and then learning. And then in 10 years' time, we'll destroy all of our PPE stocks because someone in some ministry will say that we're carrying too much costs and we should shut factories, like we shut our gas storage. But if we're smart enough to realise these things, they do come around quite regularly, and it's probably not a bad idea to have national resource silos built up. That's happening in the United States, not just with healthcare, but with rare earths, with lots of materials and technologies, where suddenly there are national security issues. How China responds to that, I don't know. But those disease environments are hugely significant, and like I said, magnified by climate.
Okay, I wanted to pick up, Peter, you mentioned that biotech representatives went to Germany on the plane, but you know what happened? The mRNA vaccine is very effective, but it's only been commissioned for foreigners in China, and there aren't many foreigners there anymore. So the Chinese obviously probably found out how to make this, but it has to be a Chinese vaccine, and they can't manufacture this. They don't want to. I don't know why. It's very complex, but I don't. They could use it for all the Chinese population. It's been effective, but I think Xi Jinping, his initial narrative was that we are doing better than the West, and that the fact that the markets were going crazy when biotech showed up, and they thought, wow, this is great. This will be great for China, but they only said this for foreigners. Rana Mitter, also a professor at Oxford, has said he's fearful that China is like going back to China, like this wave of history where they burnt all the boats, all the ships in the past. They're kind of pulling up the gates again. He said this would be a mistake for them to do. Some people are questioning, is this what they're doing now? Are they kind of pulling back? Even Mao said, half the women hold up the sky. He was more of a feminist than Xi Jinping. So women, anything that is a possible threat to the Chinese Communist Party, any competing power center like Falun Gong, which was really a breathing exercise, anything, feminists are a competing power, possible competing power for the Chinese Communist Party. And these people are put down. And we're going back in time. And they're so paranoid that any grouping could be a threat to them. So even feminists now are suspect. And then look what happened to Australia. I mean, I have to keep it sharp and short about COVID, but there's been reams and reams written about this. But the fact that the Australian government said, can we have an investigation into the origin so that we don't repeat the same mistake again? What happened to them? China had immediate economic sanctions. They're finally maybe going to have a little meeting on the sidelines of the G20, so to try to renew relations with Australia. So it was taboo, and we saw that. And you've all read, there's so much stuff, but I would suggest if you want something very clever, Perry Link, who's an expert on Chinese language, looked at how the Chinese expressed all of these things. And I'm sorry, I lived in China. I was a bit suspicious when they're like, it's a wet market. It's got to be the web. As soon as they point their finger at something, you should be a little skeptical. So Google Perry Link. He's a scholar from Princeton who wrote a great essay about the origins, just looking at Chinese language sources. Okay.
That's great. Look, diseases, naturally occurring diseases are highly, that they break anyway. It's a bit like asking who was the first person who had AIDS. It doesn't really help us that much, and it's been weaponized, the fact that it happened in Wuhan. I mean, if it had broken out anywhere else, it matters to the extent of what was the failing of the authorities in Wuhan and Beijing to not lock it down sooner and quicker, and that, I think, is significant. But I think that the disease question is one we've got to be slightly careful with, because when this breaks from wherever it is, and when I did a little bit of work around that after it happened, and there are two smallpox facilities that hold smallpox. One is in the United States, one is in Russia. The Russian facility caught fire and blew up. There's no sort of inventory of what happened, how things get released. And even Fort Detrick, which is the US major infectious disease center, was shut for a year by Congress because of breaches of health and safety. So things get out into the open air, and naturally occurring ones, it's a slightly different one to when they've been tampered with. But as far as I'm aware from from you and Bernie, my friend and colleague, this is all natural, and that means the shape of it looks slightly different. Roseanne Lake, by the way, my friend who the Sunday Times brought to Cheltenham for the Literary Festival with me in 2019 or 2018, left over in China, the women shaping the next superpower. Roseanne Lake, who's terrific. She was with the Journal, I think, in Shanghai, and now with The Economist in Cuba, I think.
All right, we've got 4 or 5 questions left. We've got about 10 to 12 minutes left, so let's see how far we can go. First up is Rachel Donadio, then Katrin Benhold, then Shadi Hamid, then Rim. Sarah Alloway. Okay.
Thank you. Fascinating. You mentioned interviewing students who are applied to Oxford for now, for at least, I don't know, at least 20 years. A lot of Chinese students have gone to the United States for higher education, also for private high school. I wonder, any sense of whether they've gone back to China? Is there any sense of an impact they might have had on making China more open, or is it just the money comes from China, they get educated in the West, stay in the West? Journalists have all, but many journalists have been kicked out of China. Any sense, does anyone have any leverage to help get some of them back in? As you know, the New York Times Bureau moved from Beijing to Hong Kong, from Hong Kong to Seoul, South Korea, where it is now. And finally, for Teresa, you mentioned extraterritorial reach and Chinese police stations across the EU. That's the first I've ever heard of that. I wonder if you could just tell us what you're talking about. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, well, Safeguard Defend published a report, but there's also an article about it today in the Financial Times. And I mean, it's pretty shocking to me because they could have done this through consulates if they say that they're there to just kind of help Chinese renew their driver's license, for example. But no, anyway, you can read the article. Sometimes, I do wonder about this. There's a huge amount of Chinese that come to the United States and study. Yale Law School. Sometimes we have these people who just learn English perfectly, and then you debate them and become almost incredible propagandists. I don't know if some of them return to China and feel frustrated, or they just accept how the situation is. I remember when I first moved from China to Brussels, and it was at the time of the Olympics, and so the Chinese students were encouraged by the embassy, or kind of told by the embassy they had to go protest, because remember there was problems with the torch relay, because some Tibetan activists are like, no. So the Chinese students were marching around Brussels saying this was all evil and bad. And I just started talking to them, and I was curious what their positions were and how they were organized. And they said the head of the wife of the ambassador had organized them. And then she's like, but you don't understand China, you don't know anything about China. And I'm like, oh, I just came from there. And as soon as I said that, she's like, and then she walked away. Like, she didn't want to talk to me then, because she felt that her talking, my perception was that her talking points were arranged, but if you talk to someone who had actually lived in China, it was going to be useless. So I don't know how, I think that they must suffer. I really do think they must have a hard time, because they know what the red lines are, and the red lines are getting stronger and stronger. And we saw this Chinese professor that was at Princeton, and they called her like a science queen. She was beautiful, and she decided to go back to China, and she got all this publicity. And she could not cope with the lack of the internet. She couldn't. So after a couple of years, she went back to the US. And those are stories I don't think they want to report too much about. So there are a lot of restrictions, and I think it must be very difficult for some people.
Let's go to Katrin Benhold with New York Times, Berlin.
I'll come back.
Oh, sorry. No, go for it.
No, I mean, I'm conscious of time. I mean, I think that these things, they are constantly changing. So basically, science undergrads and graduates who left China between, until about 2016, 2017, all stayed in the West, almost exclusively. Some went back. In the 3 years before COVID and the travel restrictions, that rising level of nationalism, the kind of anti-Western rhetoric, the incentives to come back meant that much, much higher numbers went back to China because of the emphasis on patriotism, nationalism, serving the state and serving the country. So they're moving targets. As far as leverage, Rob will be able to tell you about how one runs an office in China and how difficult it is. I mean, my own very anecdotal observations, and again, it's a change. My book on Silk Roads was translated to China and got a lot of coverage in the Chinese press, and I was invited there lots to come and talk, and I never had any problems about freedom of speech. Audiences and young people were quite often critical, including on camera. No problems about reporting stuff, but that all started to harden. So China in the 2010s was quite active in translating books and bringing stuff in. In 2018, end of 2018, that sort of stopped. So publications of foreign books into translations into Chinese have really slowed down. You can get through it. I had no censorship on my first book. They tried to do censorship on my second, and there was a long discussion that ran into the ground because of COVID. And some of the things that they wanted me to take out, which I refused to do, were obvious sensitive points. But then there were things I've struggled to kind of understand. So that process of what it is that they're worried about you talking about, what they're okay about, it's a tricky one. I guess if you're from the Journal or the Times or the Economist, you are on a much higher level of supervision, but there is a much higher levels of tolerance if you're kind of a freewheeler, where you were able to talk about things and to have reasonable discussions. But like Teresa said, that did start to change before COVID. My guess is we've gone significantly backwards.
And I'll just add one thing more. In the past, it was always desirable to have a US or European education, but now those people can't find, it's getting more difficult for them to find jobs because they're not considered patriotic enough. So people who go to Tsinghua, like the top Chinese universities, are actually first choice now. And the ones who paid all this money for these educations abroad are kind of being discriminated against now. Things change all the time, as Peter noted, but that seems to be, in this patriotic era that we're in now, they're kind of looked at suspiciously. Some of them.
Catherine.
So I'm curious, Peter, you mentioned that China calls itself the largest democracy in the world now. I mean, they've been incredibly good over the last 40 years, haven't they, in kind of cannibalizing our Western liberal societies for whatever is useful, whether that's a narrative or intellectual property or technology or whatever. I remember kind of a crazy story from the 80s. My good friend Andrew Higgins, who was then in China and actually covered Tiananmen Square, was kicked out subsequently. He's never gone back. But he remembered this story in like one of those third or fourth tier cities where they had gotten their Western metaphors kind of wrong. They wanted to celebrate a Western Christmas in a mall to sell more things. But and there was a big cross in the opening of the mall in the foyer, and Santa was nailed to it. So those were the early days, but that's a long time ago. Since then, they've become very good at using what they can from our societies. And I'm curious, and I would love a quick answer from both of you on the question: what can we learn from China? Because outcomes do matter for democracies. We had a big discussion with Shadi yesterday. Our democracies would be stronger if our outcomes were better, and arguably, China has pretty good outcomes on certain metrics. So what can we learn from that?
I'll give a quick. Do you want to go, Teresa, or shall I? I'll do a quick answer. So when Teresa mentioned the Xi-Biden readout, I got up the Chinese equivalent, which doesn't mention Cold War, doesn't mention any of the things that the United States mentioned in theirs. But the single line that jumps out is that in the Chinese readout of the meeting, it says, the United States has American-style democracy, China has Chinese-style democracy. Right? So China's been very good at working out our sensitivity points and working out how to engage with us in ways that need us to stop and think. One of the leading intellectuals who's around Xi said quite recently, he said, paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact quote, but something like, China is very good at learning from the West, but the West are incapable, he says, incapable of learning from China. And I think that those kinds of questions are really important. I mean, I think authoritarian regimes around the world in the last 15, 20 years, of which have grown in number and have grown in intensity, democracy is in real retreat. And we talked about that yesterday. And again, there was some Pew research done last week that I saw that said 61% of people in Western European countries believe that the right form of government is a strong leader with no need to go to elections. Right? That should scare us all. Under 35s, 61%. I think that states have become much more agile at working out what those outcomes should be. Maybe not political or social reforms, but getting rid of corruption, having improved judiciaries that maybe are still on the way. And I think there's a lot we should learn about what is it that our outcomes should be. I mean, like I said yesterday in my question, the question of inequality is the fundamental question about our challenges in Western-style democracies, where we're leaving way too many people behind, not just because people at the top are getting richer, which is a function of inefficient taxation and elites having too much power, but failure to understand what it is that we should be doing. I mean, ironically, I say this as a Brit with great sadness. The European Union has been quite good at equalising some of those things. As a community of nations in Europe, we chose in Britain to go a slightly different way. In fact, our best outcomes of inequality, some of them were engineered by the motor of the European Union by investing in low-income areas like Cornwall and Wales and North East, where we had low levels of investment. So it's a real shame we chose to go the way we did, but let's hope the guys have a plan. But in terms of what we can learn, I think it's first to learn that the competitors, if we want to call them that, or our competitor set, perhaps less aggressive, our peer group, are much more agile, much more sophisticated, much better at doing lots of things than we think. And rather than thinking this is an oppressive surveillance society that lock people up, we should also be trying to see what's in the plus column about how they'd be able to bring people along and where are they right in saying that we're getting things wrong. So again, the US readout, China is following socialism the United States is pursuing capitalism. And for a significant part of the world's population, socialism doesn't have the same context as it does to my generation of oppression of the communist and Soviet world. It means a world where people are more equal. And I can promise you China is a highly unequal society that hangs on to wealth, possibly even more so than we do in the West. But I think learning how to focus on outcomes, it would be worth our while.
I'll just make a quick comment in the light of time, but I love that story about Santa on the cross. I know Andrew, he's a good friend, and I lived across from the shopping mall, and they had a nativity scene, and then Christmas is before Chinese New Year, so then they just put a pig, because it was the year of the pig, in where Jesus was. They just pulled Jesus out and put the pig in for the year of the pig. And sometimes we would laugh and say, did they get stuck on the wrong page? Like, they must have a book of decorations, and it would be Easter, but they would have Halloween decorations up at one restaurant. The thing is, even authoritarian regimes, they love the word democracy. So Russia describes himself as a democracy. Xi Jinping is a Democrat. He wants to be called president. And so I think the Chinese say, we are so good, with our surveillance state. We know what you want before you even know it. So it's like precog, right? There's that film with your buddy.
Tom Cruise?
Tom Cruise.
Yeah.
So this whole idea of precog.
Friends, yeah.
So this is like, I think this is, the Chinese are saying, we are so much better than the West. We know what you want before you do. So I think this is something we have to get our own house in order. We have to improve our own democracies. Yeah. And we are out of shape, flabby. We really need to make an improvement. So that was my comment.
Xinhua, the day after the Brexit vote and after the Trump vote, said that's what democracy does.
I wonder if we can conclude maybe with a brief democracy question from the democracy expert in the room who's just written about the problem of democracy, Chinese style or American or otherwise, or maybe that's not your question. Shadi, how about the last question from you? And then we'll get an answer, and then we'll wrap and make a move. You're up. No, come on.
You sure? Let's take both. Let's take Reem as well.
All right, Reem, you got it. You're up.
Thank you so much, both of you. It was brilliant. Just to follow up, you were asking about feminist movements. So I will go back to the Uighurs and ask you if there is an organic Chinese movement to denounce what's going on. I was thinking about, I don't know if you remember, so she was not Chinese, but she used a Chinese tool to denounce what's going on with the Uyghur TikTok, the makeup artist on TikTok, who, explain you how to do your smoky eyes for your evening, and by the way, the Uyghur, etc. And there was a huge outcry from the Chinese regime who banned her, and then one thing leading to another, so she used their technique. But is there something, because there are a lot of Chinese students, we were talking about it, studying abroad, and so what is the role of the Chinese people, and when will it end? What will it take for the genocide to finally come to an end, and will it mark the end of the dictatorship? I don't think so, but again, I'm not an expert, so voila.
Okay. Should we take Shadi too? And
Please,
then do both
comment,
together,
question?
Yeah.
Yep.
I think what I was going to bring up has been covered.
Great.
Yeah, yes.
Great. Great. Okay, so quick closing, maybe minute comment apiece, friends, and then here's what we've got coming. We're going to use the restroom if you need to. Walk to the vans. There are 5 vans out there waiting for us. We're going to take a 10-minute ride, maybe a 7-minute ride down the road to the Villa Afrusi. Some of you who were here last year remember it. If you don't remember it, you're in for a treat. It's awesome. James has a book about it, or at least about the family, the Rothschild. So you ask him about the curiosities if you would. But we're going to have a lovely lunch that is awaiting for us. And then at 1:30, we'll have a little conversation that Emma and Katrin are going to lead. It's more of a conversation about journalism today. So,
oh no, I'll let you go ahead.
Please.
Go ahead.
Organic denouncements and so on. I mean, it's tricky in a society that self-censors and is censored to know. I think what's in the way that the world works in mysterious ways and rhyming patterns. Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongrun, was in charge of Xinjiang province when he was a uprising star of the Communist Party, and took a very soft line on minority populations at the time. So he wrote about, before he was disgraced and sent to go live in a cave, that cracking down on Uyghurs and minorities would be hugely counterproductive and would generate resentment. And so while there was lots of noises at that time too about minorities and redistribution of populations into Tibet and the Han Chinese and so on, Xi Jinping was extremely pacific about saying that we had to think carefully about how to protect minorities and also to evaluate what point they are a threat and at what point they enrich Chinese societies. So one might have thought that his son would be conciliatory. And so I guess then the question is, what is the threat that the Uyghurs really represent that have brought around this level of crackdown? And it's, in my view, it's not so much about minorities, of which there are 147 languages in China. There are lots of other minorities that have also been stamped on in Mongolia, in Tibet, obviously Hong Kong, and so on. But it would look to me that the pattern is more about securing China's peripheries and the worries around what happens if you are being compressed by outside forces, about where places can be influenced and problems brought around. So with the Uyghurs, the reason this really started was that when there were a couple of terrorist attacks that were not enormously damaging in the kind of grand scheme of things, the thing that really startled the Chinese authorities is that they had not, despite the surveillance 2005, 6, 7, had not seen any of this coming. So that threat of worrying that there's a fifth column that must be brewing somewhere, seeing ISIS and the Taliban in Afghanistan, still significant caches of weapons deposited by the CIA and training camps established in Xinjiang in the 80s to deal with Afghanistan, has led to a disproportionate crackdown on Uyghurs more than anybody else in China, although, like I said, other minorities too. But I think it's surprising, given Xi's family background, that one would think that one would have the same kind of lightness of touch, but that's been absolutely lacking.
Okay, in the light of time, I'll keep it short and sharp. 3 points. Just to pick up on an earlier point about social credit scores. Yes, we have lots of cameras, but we don't have a social credit score on our phones. That's a big difference between China and us. Yes, I live in Brussels. We had the bombing. They found Hatman through all the footage, and we saw what they could do back then. I'm sure it's much, much better now through AI. So, but we don't have a social credit score, and I think that's a major difference, even though we do have surveillance. When I was in Uzbekistan, I did a lot of interviews, and what was happening at the time was the mobilization, or the partial mobilization from Russia. So you had all these Uzbeks who were working in Russia coming back to Central Asia. In addition to that, you had all these Russians coming back from Russia trying to escape going to war in Ukraine. When I checked in at night, it was really late, and they said, "Our hotel is so full, would you like to share your room with someone you don't know?" And I'm like, no, thank you. The place was positively bulging at the seams with Russians, so I didn't want to do that, and I finally found a room. But the other issue, I guess, is for the region, it's not, right now, this is a second order effect of the war in Ukraine that is not on anyone's radar. They aren't so worried about militant Islam, people told me, in the region. They are worried about all this population coming back and in an economically difficult situation right now. So this could be destabilizing in Central Asia, having all these people coming back, and that money that they would send back from Russia, that's not going to be there anymore from the jobs that they used to do. Xi Jinping's father, earlier on in his career, was in Tibet, and people thought, oh wow, when Xi comes to power, maybe he'll be nice like his dad was to the Tibetans. But we see a very different Xi Jinping. He's not really like his father. He's actually doubled down. And some have wondered, there were two routes to take. One would try to be, hearts and mind campaign, but they didn't do that. And so I think that there will be huge reverberations from this. I think perhaps there are some people that regret this policy because it's just creating more and more problems. And I should just end on this final note. Right now, everyone's kind of wondering about China and how, people are like, have you read this report? It's so frightening. But you know what could happen? I mean, they're so smart. They're really good at reinventing and rebranding themselves. So I would say watch what happens in Ukraine, because China is really good about building infrastructure, doing all these things. And the Ukrainian government is not saying, cutting any ties with China, because they know that they need China after the war. So the US is trying very hard with their allies to get funding to help rebuild Ukraine. They're trying to look ahead. But I imagine China will come in, help get some of those contracts, rebuild and rebrand themselves as kind of the savior of Ukraine. That could happen.
Thank you both very much.